Much and Chetan for all of your work, organizing this, managing it, keeping it going, keeping us going, by giving us the space to do this. Um, really grateful for everyone's present, especially in a time where we're all under so much duress. When it appears that we have free time or more discretionary time, but then we find out that the demands of meeting our survival needs and coping actually take a tremendous amount of time and energy. So I'm just really grateful for this, the solidarity that is, just the fact of us being together like this, as we have been for a few weeks now. It's been really amazing to just be with people here. Normally, what we do at the beginning of these sessions is have folks introduce themselves in some way, shape, or form. I actually would like to do that, even though we are a rather large group. I feel like it's really important to acknowledge the existential dimension of what we're doing here. That this isn't about information or ideas or even about knowledge. This is about the act of showing up for one another. Um, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask folks to be fairly brief, because we do have quite a few people on, which is amazing. We're up to 28 now, but I'm gonna use my screen, and because of the way that the layout goes, it flicks around depending on who's joining. So I'll try to stay organized. But if I get towards the end and miss someone, I'll ask if I've overlooked anybody. But if you could just say maybe who you are, where you are, and very briefly, something about yourself that you feel comfortable sharing. I want to get a sense of who you are, and then when we get done with that, I'll introduce Richard and Devin, and I'm going to make a few remarks, a few words here, just to get things started. But before I do that, I want to introduce Richard and Devin a little bit more formally, not much. But I also want everybody to know I'm going to be mindful of our needs for breaks and for pauses and things like this, as we go on. So know that there'll be some breaks built in, as well as you should feel free to do what you need to do in that way. Richard Robbins is an anthropologist up at SUNY Plattsburgh, and a very distinguished scholar and longtime professor up there. Richard and I met a couple summers ago when I was giving a community-based course called "What Do We Owe Each Other" at a retreat center near him, and he got wind of it and graciously showed up and contributed to that in a really powerful way. And I've been really impacted by his work, and really glad that he's here. Devin and I also met through our work. Devin Singh's a professor up at Dartmouth, but he's at Princeton this year on a research fellowship and stuck there now because of the epidemic. I think Devin and I are part of a sort of handful of people that have been thinking about sort of the intersections of religion and economics for quite a while now. Like Jim Wetzel also mentioned that he was. But of course, there are other people out there doing this work in interesting ways too. Philip Goodchild, to some extent, Adam Costco, Electrostimuli, Desmond Lowton. There's a kind of growing interest in sort of the long history of the imbrication of religion and economics and politics. The anthropologists have been doing this work really for a long time, but some people are starting to pay attention, Richard, to what you've been looking at forever. So I always say that the anthropologists are my favorite philosophers. I'm probably more from them than anyone else, and that's true. I actually mean that very seriously. But just to get things sort of started here, I think some of you may have noticed a couple days ago, Glenn actually posted this um, on. I'm going to throw the a link up here in the chat. Glenn actually posted this on his Facebook page. Um, uh, let me make sure this is everybody. There was a really big time venture capitalist who basically came out a few days ago very publicly saying that this bailout that recently came through, which obviously favored um, major corporations and then the financial sector, was a mistake. And acting as a good class trader here, he gave this kind of, you know, really wicked kind of, you know, 3 or 4 line argument about why this was ridiculous, and that people should be, you know, ordinary people are the ones who should be bailed out, and that the idea that the corporations need a bailout is absurd. And his point here is, I put it in put the quote in there in the chat, but his point is that people who hold, you know, equity or unsecured debt tranches by investing in companies are taking a certain kind of risk, that it should be on them. It shouldn't be up to the government to protect that risk, and that kind of investment is totally different from the stake in companies that people have who are employed by them, or who are, you know, living from their wages. And yet, you know, we see this kind of confusion all the time in the way people tend to talk about debt. And I'm going to go back to my screen here and share it with you, just to pick up on a couple of things from what I did last time. Toggling around Zoom here to make this possible. Let's see what we get out of. Sorry, I'm trying to find my option for screen share. Chetan, for some reason I can't see my screen share option. Do you know why that might be?
Just below the video. It doesn't appear right there.
Oh, here it is. Thank you. Okay. Okay. So can everybody see it now?
Yeah.
Okay. So one of the big confusions that we have about debt is we tend to think that a loan is a loan is a loan, right? Borrowing is borrowing is borrowing, lending is lending. But it really, and Richard will explain this in much more detail, you know, taking a loan in order to make ends meet, in order to even in order to start a business, is radically different from taking out a loan to then do what hedge funds do or big banks do, which is to make speculative investments, looking for a certain rate of return. It's an incredibly important and profound difference. And one of the really pernicious things about the neoliberal era we've been in for the last 30 or 40 years is that it's sort of convinced everyone to think about their householding needs and their provisioning needs as if they were little miniature investments, and that if everyone's kind of selfhood even was a kind of entrepreneurship, and that even the kind of most basic levels of care and reproduction and reparation that we need to survive are little miniature investments. And this sets up this really toxic situation in which, especially in the developed world, or, you know, the United States and Europe, or the, you know, so-called developed world, it is the global north. You know, we have this weird way in which we can't see the radical differences in power and prerogative and privilege between people who are borrowing and lending to make speculative returns, as opposed to people who are, you know, in massive amounts of credit card debt to pay bills, or in catastrophic healthcare, under catastrophic healthcare bills, or whatever. And so it's really one of the things that we need to think really seriously about, in order to kind of insist that the creditor classes be held to account for their risks, and that they not be bailed out, because they're really different in kind from the kinds of risks that most of us are taking just to survive. But I wanted to say in a minute here, part of why it's hard for us to see this as well is because of the nature of the money supply itself. Most folks, you know, aren't really aware of this. Even most economics courses don't really reveal this in any kind of a clear way. But the money supply itself is almost entirely a creation of private banks. Money enters the economy as a loan from a private bank to a borrower, an individual or business or whatever. And this is, in fact, one of the reasons, maybe the primary reason, why large-scale finance is always immediately bailed out in a crisis, and why they remain protected while a sort of austerity is meted out to the rest of the economy. Interestingly, the interesting exception here is the military budget, which never seems to have to tighten its belt. And there's a very interesting historical reason for that I learned about a lot about from Richard too, which is the very existence of central banking as sort of massive loans that are generally used to finance kind of military and colonizing and other kinds of predatory and violent state operations. But the idea here is that if it's the case that money is created privately, then of course the financial system has to be bailed out, because otherwise loans will dry up and there'll be no more money for what little economy is left. And this places an extraordinary and exorbitant amount of power in the hands of private creditors who are, as you can see in the slide here, they're unaccountable to public oversight. The majority of the bonds that are held by the largest financial concerns are used to finance warfare, military budgets, and perhaps most significantly from our perspective here in kind of ecological endgame is that the very continuity of the money supply requires perpetual and unsustainable economic growth. And this is due to the fact that if banks enter new money into the economy as loans that they expect to make a rate of return on, if the economy as a whole is not growing fast enough to continue to pay off at least a good portion of that interest, then the banks lose confidence and credit seizes up, and the entire economy shuts down with it, which is exactly what we saw happening in 2008, and arguably why, again, the banking system was bailed out. And just a few more minutes here, I'll elaborate on what I've said here to kind of set the stage, and then I'm going to turn it over to Richard. Again, contrary to what most people think, the banks are not really intermediaries. They don't really take from savers and then lend to borrowers, and in fact, you know, banks weren't even created, and vast fortunes behind them weren't really created by people saving. They were actually rooted in plunder and warfare and the history of inheritance and really a lot of violence that Marx calls primitive accumulation. And on the basis of this kind of enduring power and very complex relationships with the state and kinds of legal I've done a legal basis that banks have the right to issue loans at interest as a way of kind of having monopoly power over national currencies, and this makes them what Herman Minsky called the merchants of debt, and all of our currency is actually in hock to their willingness to continue to speculate on the future of the economy. Just a little bit more. This is from Richard's book with Tim DiMuzio on Debt as Power. It's really sobering and harrowing to see how deeply the money supply is tied into the very existence of a massive military budget. It could be actually that the United States could actually achieve a balance of payment surplus if you took out the military budget, but that of course would contract the money supply, because the money, the very creation of new loans is actually very much backed by the confidence in the banks and their ability to capitalize things like the U.S. government, especially the U.S. Debt over time, which is linked to its expenditures, especially in the military. So you can see how that's a problem, and then finally, as I mentioned before, most of us are very aware now that perpetual growth on a finite planet is an illusion. It's a fantasy. It's a contradiction. If the loans that are produced for starting new businesses are all ultimately owed back to banks at a certain rate of interest, the only way to keep paying that interest is through more economic growth. But the more growth you have, the more is owed back to the banks. So you have this massive debt overhang that's just expanding exponentially and sucking up more and more of the planet's resources to make those payments. Literally, causing the environmental catastrophe that we're living through, among other things. And the last point I want to make, and because it's a point that Richard makes in his book, is the absurdity of the choice for austerity from this point of view, which Mayor Kinney here in Philadelphia a couple of days ago announced that coming out of this epidemic, we'd all have to tighten our belts, and there'd be some unfortunate cuts to city budgets and spending, and we're all really gonna feel this, and again, it goes back to kind of the illusion I started with of the world of finance being one big household in which we're all kind of in it together, and we all have to kind of do our part, when crisis comes. But I really love this line from Richard and Tim's book. A more apt household metaphor, I'm just reading the slide here, would be one in which one sibling among 10 expropriated 50% of the family income, leaving the rest for his 9 brothers and sisters. Furthermore, if the family income ever declined, he demanded to be reimbursed first when it increased again, insisting that his brothers and sisters give him a portion of their income if he suffered any loss. I'm eager in a way to start hearing from Richard and Devin, but before we do that, maybe I know that was a little fast and furious, but I know a lot of you were here last time, and I just kind of wanted to set the stage. But does anybody want to make a initial comment or have a question for clarification about anything I said before I turn it over to Richard here? He's gonna elaborate and go further on a lot of these points, but anybody have a question or comment?
Can I just say something real quickly?
Yeah.
For those of you who are new to one of our seminars here, this is a place where you should feel free and comfortable making any kind of comment or question, or asking for clarification. These are supposed to be this is a real community of dialogue. So if you feel a little shy or something, you can use the chat to ask questions or make comments. We really want to start fostering open communication, and that's outside of any kind of intimidation about education and all that nonsense. So relax and give us what you got.
Yeah, I thank you for reiterating that, Glenn. Yeah, Alex, it looks like you have a question. Would you mind speaking now? Yeah.
This might be too too specific of a question, but I'm curious as we go through the discussion, if anyone has an idea on a statistic of how much of global debt is made up of actual interest versus the actual principal. I'm thinking of like development loans from the World Bank, the IMF and whatnot, or even just global debt as a whole.
Yeah, I think we could get some numbers up on that. I'm almost sure Richard can speak to that.
Okay.
So do you have a quick and ready answer for that, Richard? You're muted, by the way, Richard. You're still
Gotcha. Okay. 80% of all investment securities are debt-based. And there's right now probably at various estimates about $250 trillion in debt out there. And I pointed out, I think, in one thing in the book, in the United States, people pay more in interest than they do in federal taxes.
Yeah, very significant point. Yeah, thank you, Richard. Any other questions for clarification on anything I said before? And just to reiterate what, like, amplify what Glenn said. I mean, folks, there's a lot of folks that don't know me that well. I mean, I came to political economy and economic anthropology like way after I finished my PhD 10 years ago. I still consider myself just an amateur trying to learn this stuff. So you're in good hands here. We can ask the the naive questions together. I think those are the important ones to ask. Actually, I think we have too much economic sophistication in a way. I think we need to ask really simple questions. So let's do that together. Anything else? Okay. Just keep in mind, I'm going to be playing moderator through a lot of this. Get my attention however you need to. You can use
a question.
I'm right. It's Chetan. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I saw Jim's hand. I just wanted to.
Yeah. I was just saying that I can't see the whole screen all the time. So just be patient with me. Was that you, Jim?
Yeah, I have a very basic question, and Joshua, you may try a stab at it, but anybody else? So where does money come from?
Well, in the account I was just laying out, modern money, because archaically money has multiple origins, and those origins are really interesting to think about. But from what I understand, almost all money in the contemporary world originates as a private bank loan. So strictly speaking, modern money is debt. It is portable, fungible debt. So if I have dollars in my pocket, it literally represents a bank's confidence that it's going to make a return on whatever investment was behind me ending up with that money, whether that was in the institution that employed me or some other level of lending that happened. So we're all literally carrying around in our wallet. This is why Minsky calls the banks merchants of debt. We're carrying around little tokens of a handful of private bankers' confidence in the future of the economy to give them a certain rate of return, literally. I mean, that's the way I understand it. But,
maybe Sebastian here, I'd like to make a point as well. Money is also created by taking taxes. That's the other part. Because you have to pay taxes and you somehow have to organize the money to pay your taxes, and that's how the states create money or value.
Yeah, if I could just jump into just to sort of coordinate those. I mean, this is basically what we've heard credit and state theories right now being mentioned. These are two different theories about money, but they do work together. And so what Joshua is talking about in terms of money being created through lending under capitalism merges with state forms of regulation. So what Sebastian is signaling in terms of taxation is one of those. And so capitalist credit money is the merger of private bank loans with some sort of centralized accounting system under the state. So that's what we see emerging, in the Italian city-states, but then really gets off the ground with the Bank of England.
Right.
So there's different regimes of this and different historical moments, but at least in terms of our current regime of capitalist credit money is a particular merger of bank loans that then get subsumed under a national system that's integrated into the tax circuit.
Yeah, and just to connect that, thank you, Devin, and thank you, Sebastian. Just to connect that point to Richard's work and something I mentioned, which is when the loan that created the Bank of England was originally given to the Crown by this handful of merchants and financiers, it was primarily going to be used for the colonizing and war efforts of the Crown. So there's this very tight link between the need for large-scale state military budgets and a unified currency, what the willingness of the financiers to give the loan actually gave them a monopoly over the currency and the right to standardize it and issue it, which is very important as well, because at the time there were a lot of local and complementary currencies in England that had to be sort of crushed in order for this to work. So, do you want to add something to that, Richard?
Not right now, Joshua. It's okay. I think you and I think Devin and Sebastian did a good job with it.
Okay.
It's in fact, I'll deal with it, but just in a tangential way, actually.
Okay, sounds good. I mean, just to make one last quick comment, and I want to turn it over to Richard. I mean, Jim is asking a much larger and deeper question here, because there are other origins of money as well in the accounting system of the ancient agrarian empires that enabled very sophisticated forms of lending to go on over time, and in order to organize the granaries that facilitated the life of those empires. That's a very important early origin of money, but also throughout the world, fines and penalties that were levied against people who had injured one another or who had done violence to one another is another origin of money, of tokens of value that are meant to be taken as equalizing in some way, or setting up ability for people to measure things that are difficult to assess. So it's a really big question, because it's fairly clear from human history that money has multiple origins and multiple uses that sometimes converge and sometimes diverge over time. Yeah. Okay. And obviously, any and all questions at any point. I'll try to keep track of everyone. If I can't see, maybe Chet will let me know. But at this point, yeah, I want to have Richard say some things about the current kind of configuration and composition of global debt. He sent me a note about some things that he wants to bring forward on this that I think are really important. I'm really looking forward to it. Thanks again for being here, Richard.
Yeah, thank you, Joshua. This is great. First of all, I'm an anthropologist, part-time political economist. Teach a course on religion and belief also. It's sort of a combination of traditional anthropology and science technology studies. But what I'd like to do, and I got to thank Joshua for asking me, and also I want to maybe apologize for imposing on some of you. I took as the main problem of the discussion is how do we articulate how the economy works to people, how it works for some and not others, and how do you cut through the linguistic legerdemain that economists have used to describe how the economy works. So some good examples. I think Joshua gave you a good one with the household metaphor. Think of a national economy the way you would of a household. Which is what I'll try to show you makes no sense. And in terms of a debt action, the big issue, and Joshua addressed this at the last Insight seminar, is how do you justify a debt action in the face of an ethos that equates debt repayment with honor? That is, what threat could be so great as to motivate people to rebel against an economic system that they've been taught benefits them? And Joshua also gave me some leeway, said I could talk about 25, 30 minutes. So again, why I ask your indulgence. But I've put together some slides that I'll probably go through fairly quickly, largely to essentially try out on you a way of looking at the economy that not many economists use, in fact, if any. And I briefly sort of titled it Savage Finance and the Tyranny of the Rate of Return. And as I said, I want to look at and try to describe to you two problems. Everyone see the screen okay? No
Yes.
problem. Good. Two major problems I want to look at. One is a contradiction between two types of capital. One I'm calling investment capital, the other I'm calling civic capital. And the fact that one completely overwhelms the other, that makes doing anything about a lot of our problems, as I'll try to show you, as things are, virtually impossible. The other problem has to do with a mathematical issue that rarely, if ever, is addressed in economics. And that is that a rate of return on capital requires economic growth. And rate of return on capital has remained remarkably steady over the past 150 years. In fact, it's actually gone up. And it's done that in the face of declining economic growth. And I want to show you what some of the consequences of that are. But I want to begin actually with a story, actually with a prank. I don't know how many of you ever heard of the Yes Men. A group of guys who actually for the last almost 30 years have been pulling off all sorts of stunts to illustrate the absurdity of globalization, economic growth, et cetera. And one of the recent stunts, which they did in January of 2019, is they sent a fake letter to all of the clients of BlackRock Investing. And they sent it as it was from their CEO, Larry Fink. And Fink essentially said in this fake letter that BlackRock was no longer going to invest in companies that did not meet the Paris Climate Accords. In fact, BlackRock was one of the largest investment wealth management companies in the world. And at the time, we're most heavily invested in petroleum and fossil fuels. Well, anyway, Fink then sent his real letter out, not referring to the Yes Men, but in it, he included this one statement that I think was fascinating. And he said, our firm is built, and you can see it on the screen, our firm is built to protect and grow the value of our clients' assets. In many cases, I or other senior managers may not agree with the same cause, or we might strongly disagree. But our personal views on environmental or social issues don't matter here. Our decisions are driven solely by our fiduciary duty to our clients. Now, in fairness to Fink, he was later taken over the coals by other wealth managers because he made an announcement to his staff that they were going to make an issue, they were going to make an attempt to hire more women and more minorities. One critic said that's simply corporate socialism. Fink also, by the way, did claim this year that they would stop investing in fossil fuel companies, but that's largely not because of the Yes Men, but largely because they're no longer, doing what they, have a rate of return that they once did. But anyway, by 2021, wealth managers and capital controllers such as Larry Fink will control some $70 trillion, equal to the present total GDP of all the countries in the world. If you add to this the over 100 trillion controlled by pension funds, insurance companies, and investment capital controlled by banks and other private investors, the amount of money in 2018 that must generate an appreciable rate of return exceeded $300 trillion and is projected to reach 456 trillion by 2024. And as I mentioned before, as of now, almost 80% of that wealth is invested in debt instruments. Now understand what Fink and other wealth managers are saying. They're saying that we have to realize a rate of return on our investment, regardless of the externalities of those investments, period. And I think in fairness to them, any wealth manager that didn't do that, that is, that was realizing a rate of return less than what their competitors were doing, would lose all their clients. Now oh, by the way, just in terms of money, because that question came up, a lot of people don't understand what we're talking about. We're talking about billion, trillions, et cetera. I love this little diagram that shows $10,000. There's a million. There's a billion. This is a trillion, which of course is 1,000 billion. But one of the questions you have is, okay, you know, who's controlling, you know, all of these assets? And here's I put up on the screen a chart that shows those people, the distribution of assets, ownership of assets that are generating these returns. As you can see, the top 1%, and I showed 2010 and then 2016. The top 1%, you go down to total assets of the group. They controlled 50.4% in 2010. 2016, they controlled 55.6%. That number, by the way, has gone up. Next 9%, as you can see, in 2016, controlled 35%. Everybody else controls now less than 9% of the assets generating a rate of return. Now, I mentioned I wanted to talk about two kinds of capital. That's investment capital. The other kind, I'm referring to civic capital. And I wanted to just briefly to give you an example, talk about civic capital in terms of environmental problems. We've got a number of them: climate change, species extinction, air pollution, water pollution, et cetera. And again, how much money is there available to counter the capital investments that take no consideration over the environmental effects of their investments? And as I said here, $350 trillion to create these problems. How much civic capital is there to fix them? I did some basic calculations, and you can see that, okay, if you assume that taxes, by the way, are probably the main source of civic capital, that is theoretically anyway, taxes don't have to generate a rate of return. And if we assume that all US federal taxes were suddenly directed away from, say, defense, social spending, government salaries, et cetera, and redirected to stopping climate change, restoring the environment, that would amount to about $3.3 trillion of investment neutral capital a year. And those are 2019 figures. If we add all state and local taxes, that would raise investment neutral money to about 5.3 trillion. Global average tax rates, 34% of GDP, using 2017 data, where global GDP was 80 trillion. US dollars would supply $27 trillion to tackle all environmental problems. Finally, if all charitable giving were directed to environmental concerns, that would add about 4.2, about $500 million in dollars, which, being generous and multiplying by 5, would equal about 2.1 trillion US dollars, investment neutral capital globally coming from charitable giving. In sum, if we devoted all potentially available investment capital, or neutral capital rather, to environmental concerns, there is at most 30 trillion competing with some 350 trillion that doesn't particularly care one way or the other what it does. Now, that's a particular problem for activists. By the way, if you look at how much money the US spends on the environment, the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, has a yearly budget right now of $9 billion, okay, competing against all that money. By the way, banks have invested about $1.9 trillion in fossil fuel. US government, if you include state governments, have about $20 billion to counter the effects of that. So one problem is how, if you're talking about trying to articulate how the economy works to the general public, how do you explain to them, in fact, that you've got, again, upwards of $350 trillion that's being invested in stuff that nobody cares what the effect is. And you've got, at best, about $30 trillion trying to fix whatever that stuff is doing. The second problem I wanted to mention that I think needs to be articulated is a mathematical problem. And it has to do with what I'm calling here the economic growth and return of capital conundrum. And simple fact, rate of return requires economic growth. And in fact, again, economists are constantly, in fact, that's the number one concern. If you look at economics textbooks of economists, is how do you do economic growth? By the way, as an aside to this, I think that's not true. I think, in fact, what economists really are talking about is not economic growth. They're really talking about the rate of return. And by avoiding talking about the rate of return, they mask the fact that most of the benefits of growth are going to a small minority. Wonderful paper, by the way, 2006, and hardly ever quoted, by Dean Baker, Brad DeLong, and Paul Krugman. And they were arguing essentially against any cut in Social Security in the United States. And they did, again, a complex mathematical study, although I'm not sure that you needed that. And they say that we see strong reasons to think that over the long run, rates of return on assets are correlated and causally connected with rates of economic growth. Here's the problem. Wonderful study was done that came out of the Federal Reserve, St. Louis Federal Reserve, in which a group of economists looked at the history of the rates of return on all kinds of investments going back to 1870. And if you look at it from, if you can see here, from 1870 to 2015, economic growth on average is about 2.5%. The rate of return on capital, though, was almost 6%. If you go post-1950, economic growth was again about 2.6%. Rate of return, again, 6%. Post-1980, and this is to some extent the neoliberal regime, you see that economic growth is about 2.3%. Rate of return is almost 7%. Mathematically, that's impossible. Okay, mathematically, that's impossible. We'll talk about how, in fact, that's been done. And here you can see just a chart on how economic growth has gone both in the US and globally from 1961 through 2018. Again, average there over 4%. Now we're struggling. We haven't reached 10%, at least in the US, for over a decade. This, by the way, was a central point of Thomas Piketty's, incredible book, Capital in the 21st Century. And in that, they had the formula, a formula that was central to their argument, that R always exceeds G. That is, the rate of return always exceeds the rate of growth. And as he showed, there's a quote from Piketty, over the past 150 years, real return on wealth has substantially exceeded the GDP growth in 13 decades and only been below GDP growth in 2 decades. By the way, that was World War II and the Depression. And we may want to talk about that later because, again, we may in fact be facing the equivalent of that in the next decade, and we need to kind of look at, what the consequences would be. So as I put here, where are we? Rate of return on capital requires exponential growth, an increase in the rate of growth. Economic growth is slowing as it must for various reasons we could talk about, but the rate of return remains steady and is growing. To do that, investors must be taking an increased share of the national income. But how are they doing that, and from whom are they taking? And one of the points that Martin Gilens and Benjamin Page have made a number of articles in a new book that's just come out is that democracy in terms of democratic decision-making in the US means nothing. That the wealthy, the policies that favor the wealthy are the ones that get chosen regardless of the feelings of the majority. And so again, investors, and again, just looking at those figures I gave you before about how much they've got, have an enormous influence, obviously, on government and on government policy. But there's another factor here that's, I think, equally important, and Devin draws attention to this in his work. And that is that the power of capital, of investment capital, and the interest of the nation state coincide. Because nation states, being among, if not the greatest borrowers and debtors in the world, have as much a vested interest in maintaining a rate of return as do private investors. And the implication here, of course, is that the state will do whatever it has to do it will enact whatever policy it has to enact in order to maintain the rate of return, even in the face of declining economic growth. And here's a little chart I put together just to show you some of those things, some of those government policies that, while seeming neutral and are advertised, they're represented as being neutral in terms of who they benefit, really benefit largely investors. And I put here simply, there's the investment, there's a rate of return. Here are things that the government does to maintain that rate of return. One, they keep inflation low. They lower taxes on investors. And I'll give you some details on this in a second. They weaken labor unions because, again, one of the people, what you're essentially doing is taking from labor to give to capital. You privatize services that ostensibly benefit all, and they benefit, in fact, only a few investors. You externalize costs. That is, again, investors don't have to pay, companies don't have to pay for the pollution that they cause and so on. You concentrate markets. The more concentrated the market, the more the corporations can control prices, labor costs, and so on. And finally, you limit bankruptcy and default. And while all these policies, I say, ostensibly benefit everybody, what I would argue is that no, they benefit the top 1%, to some extent, the top 10%. And let me sort of go through some of these to show you, in effect, what I mean and how, again, economists have masked how the economy really works in order to benefit, as I say, just a very few. But let me just, I'm kind of rushing through here, so let me pause for a second and see if there's any questions, comments.
Yeah, great idea. Any questions or comments from anybody?
There might be a few in the chat if you want to have a look.
I'm sorry, Sebastian, what was that?
Someone might want to look into the chat.
Yeah, I think.
Oh, good idea.
Yeah, actually, I think Alex had a question. Yeah, you want to voice that question, Alex?
Yeah, it was just getting back to earlier on in the presentation, just the super basic definition. So investments, and you said 80% of investments are debt instruments. I was just curious, what are non-debt instruments? Are those? Is that stock? Is that futures? What are other non-debt?
It's mostly equity, stocks. And of course, debts, I'm referring to sovereign debt, government debt, corporate debt, household debt, financial debt, and so on. And as of the last figures I could find on that were, I think, 2015. I think it was 78% of those instruments were debt instruments. The rest were mostly stocks.
On this last slide, you have the point of concentrating markets, right, and creating oligopolies. Essentially, I think of cable providers and internet service providers, right?
Yeah.
But there does seem to be this weird thing in defense of capitalism, right? There does seem to be a limit against monopolies. So why doesn't the corporate elite go fully into monopolies? Why is there this seeming equilibrium with some oligopolies? Is there something to the efficiency argument of having some competition?
Well, no, in fact, corporations generally don't like competition, and, in spite of all the talk about it, and that's been for, decades. What we've seen over the last really 20 years, particularly in the United States, by the way, is much greater concentration. Essentially, what the government is doing is ignoring antitrust laws or bypassing them. Actually, again, French economist Philippe Philippon came out with a book, I think just this year, in which he looked at the extra price paid by Americans for stuff over the last 20 years because of the market concentration. And he calculated it at about $300 a month. So that, in fact, includes higher prices than Europeans are paying for internet service, for computers, airline travel, again, a whole host of things. Any other things in the chat? Well, let me just sort of quickly run through, if I'm not imposing too much on your time with the detail. How how what government does with policy obfuscates who really benefits from it. And probably one of the most important, and certainly in terms of rate of return, is regulating inflation. By the way, central banks have as their main function controlling inflation. The US Federal Reserve, ironically, is the only other major central bank that has an added function of maintaining full employment, which they have rarely exercised. But here you can see US rate of inflation. That big spike, of course, was back in the 80s when inflation went through the roof for various reasons, partially the changes in oil prices. But as you can see, the Federal Reserve in the United States has done a pretty good job in regulating inflation, keeping it at a target rate of 2%. I say that if you're an investor, the number one thing you're concerned about is inflation. Again, a 6% return on investments doesn't mean anything if you got 6% inflation. In fact, as one wealth manager put it, he said, inflation rots bonds. So maintaining inflation is key. And what I think most people don't realize is what the Fed has done, the US Federal Reserve has done, is regulate inflation by maintaining a certain level of unemployment. That is the measure that the Federal Reserve used for cutting back essentially on the money supply. And here we get into that whole question again of where money comes from. The way they cut back on the money supply is by cutting jobs, thereby cutting wages, thereby reducing what in fact is spent, thereby keeping inflation at least a 2% level. In fact, Jerome Powell, who's the president head of the US Federal Reserve, in a Senate hearing asked about Fed policy over the last decade and said that we made a mistake, that we kept money much too tight and we lost 10 years of wages and jobs. And here, at least in the US, to give you an idea of the gap between inflation and unemployment. That is, the Fed essentially kept inflation well under whatever measure they were using of unemployment. Those striped lines represent all the jobs and wages that were lost by workers because of the Fed policy. Anyway, inflation, again, it's a fascinating thing. And again, there's other aspects to it. For example, the Fed, again, creates money, going back to that question. And they essentially create it out of thin air. And they get into circulation by buying stuff. And generally they buy government securities, but they can buy anything. That one proposal that I've talked about a number of times is let them buy student debt. That'll put $1.6 trillion into the economy and remove one form of odious debt. So that's how, again, the Fed, essentially works. One of the interesting things, the Fed has tried over the past decade to put money into circulation, but it goes to the very wealthy and it goes to the banks. And for that reason, I can show you charts if you want to later, what's called the velocity of money, that is how much money circulates, has dropped. So essentially there's more money in the economy, but it's going into people who aren't spending it. They're essentially probably mostly, again, investing it. Anyway, in addition to controlling inflation, obviously lowering taxes on investors is a major way that you maintain the rate of return. Again, you're taxed at 20%, then you're only making 20% of your investments. Again, you're not making anything. And as you can see from these charts, certainly going back to the 1930s, individual taxes have remained fairly steady. Corporate taxes in the US have simply plummeted. Now, by the way, again, I'm referring to these as civic capital. And so essentially here you see the amount of civic capital donated by individuals, the amount of civic capital donated by corporations. The bottom left chart is simply corporate tax rates globally. That is, what's happened in the US is being mirrored virtually all over the world. Also, virtually in all tax systems, capital gains, that is the money you make on investments, is taxed at a lower rate than wages. So again, another way that the government manages to favor this. By the way, wages, of course, at least in the United States, are taken out of salaries by employers. You never get a chance to do anything with it. Investors don't have to do that. They can claim how much they make. And of course, then you get that whole issue of, how much is stored overseas. Last estimates I saw were about $10 trillion that avoid taxation. As you can see, one of the things you also do is you pay less. Here's simply a chart of labor share of national income in the United States, going back to 1947, again, constantly declining. One reason, of course, is the decline of union membership in the US. That's virtually plummeted from 25, actually above 30% earlier than that, to roughly about 10% now. Another way in which, again, labor suffers is, well, here you can see, for example, corporate profits versus labor share. Here you see public versus private sector job growth. Generally, private sector job growth is no longer unionized for the most part, except in a few sectors. Public sector job growth in the US way down, partially because, of course, taxes are going down. So again, controlling inflation, taxing corporations, investors less, decreasing the labor costs, all are benefiting and maintaining that traditional rate of return. There's a second set of things that require a little more discussion, but let me sort of just go through them quickly to show you what I mean. You externalize costs. Donald Trump is doing this, is carrying this to an art form. In fact, last week, he did away with many of the emission standards for cars in the US. But one of the things you do, you eliminate government regulations or enforcement on environmental laws, labor laws, advertising. The only country in the world that has no regulations regarding advertising to kids. We advertise to 3, 4, and 5-year-olds. Virtually every country in the world has some regulations regarding what you can put, for example, on television to appeal to kids. Laws on illegal immigration. We still, again, welcome immigrants to work, certainly up in this area in our apple orchards and so on. You do away with laws, regulations regarding water pollution, air pollution, et cetera. Again, a quick chart. There's global deaths in millions per year because of air pollution. By the way, when you think COVID-16, the epidemic, those are the people that are most suffering, who have been most exposed to air pollution. People living in cities, smokers, and particularly in the United States now, minorities, who live in areas where, again, many regulations are simply not enforced. You privatize things. Another way to, again, give investors a place to put their money. One big problem that investors have today is they're running out of places to put their money. And you see all sorts of exotic investments arising. Investing in Latin American baseball players, investing in antique cars, investing in artwork. The inflation of prices in those areas is largely a result of investors having so much money that they're constantly looking for new ways to invest. Some of you probably know students are out there, and rather than borrowing money to go to school, are selling a portion of the first 10 years of their income to investors who are paying their way through college. So again, investors have a problem. They've got all this money and they have to find a place for it to grow. One of the ways that, again, government helps is by creating all kinds of debt opportunities. And debt is wonderful investments, because don't forget, when you have a debt instrument, there is a contractual agreement that it will realize a certain rate of return, 3%, 4%, 5%, whatever. Equities are no guarantee. Equities depend upon consumption, and consumption obviously can vary. Presently, there's about $244 trillion in debt out there. As you can see, financial sector, government sector, non-financial, and households. These, by the way, these debts create other places for investors to put their money. For example, a decline in civic capital in the United States has meant a diminishing support of education. Diminishing support of education means shifting the cost of education to, for example, students. Students now have to pay for their education. They borrow to do it. And so you've now got upwards of $1.5 trillion out in the United States in student debt. That's unlike any other country in the world. Although it wouldn't surprise me if we see more of that. The other factor in terms of government work, Mariana Mazzucato wrote a wonderful book called The Entrepreneurial State, debunking the public versus private sector myths. And her main point is that most private sector investments and profits come from the state. Classic example, and the iPhone. And this is a diagram from her book. And she asks, what makes the iPhone so smart? And what she shows is virtually all the major discoveries that went into the first generation iPod, iPhone, et cetera, came from taxpayers, came from work, for example, in the Department of Energy, Army Research Office, NIH in the United States National Institute of Health, NSF, Department of Defense, and on and on. These are all essentially discoveries that Apple benefited from, but didn't have to pay for. Apple, by the way, responded by doing everything they possibly could to pay as low a tax rate as they could. Move most of their operations to Ireland, for one example. We mentioned before, you ignore antitrust laws, weaken monopoly laws, enforce patent laws, and patents, of course, are simply legal monopolies. And that costs, I say, the average person, as I mentioned, or Thomas Philippon, $300 a month, more than Europeans pay for the same, for the same thing. Finally, you prevent debt default. That is one of the things, particularly when you have 80% of your investments in debt instruments. How do you protect yourself against the risk of default? That is people simply walking away from their debts. And one of them came out this year by Jerome Roos called Why Not Default? The Political Economy of Sovereign Debt. And he deals here mostly with the government debt. Now, he points out that people buy government securities. They buy bonds, US bonds, Greek bonds, French bonds, whatever. That's, again, debt. And how much interest they get, of course, depends upon what the return on that is. In the US now, return on bonds is about 1.5%. Greek bonds, about 6.6%. Argentinian bonds, almost 10%, and so on and so forth. And he asks the question, well, why don't they just default? And he points out that that globalization has created to some extent, a cabal of debt enforcers, such that where previously, if you defaulted from one bank, for example, you could then get money from another bank. And you can't do that anymore. And the global debt collector, essentially, is now the IMF. And the IMF, in order to get their countries to pay their debts, has the power to enforce, as I think Sebastian mentioned before, these austerity programs. And austerity programs are essentially geared to pay off the people who hold the debt of those countries. Primarily that. So they get paid, in some cases legally, first. Something called general obligation bonds. And a general obligation bonds, and those, by example, were the Puerto Rican bonds here. General obligation bonds promise, we will pay off the bondholders before we spend money on anything else. Police, schools, poverty, whatever. In fact, to his credit, one of the governors of Puerto Rico actually ignored that, and nevertheless still paid off some people. But here you see some of the effects of essentially debt repayment programs. In Greece, again, it's still going through this. 300,000 civil servants fired, pension payments reduced, unemployment rising to 23%, 44%, 15 to 24-year-olds out of work, and so on. Same thing in Puerto Rico. Same thing, by the way, in the United States, same thing in Great Britain, same thing in France. They're not called, for example, structural adjustment as they are in these countries. They're called austerity. Because austerity creates the myth that you've been living beyond your means. It again becomes a moral issue. And since you're living beyond your means, Therefore, you have to pay the price. And, for various reasons, that's, that you might want to discuss is crazy. Finally, just in sum, is again, all these steps that governments take, et cetera, keep investor profits growing in spite of the inherent difficulty of maintaining the necessary rate of return, although each in some way exposes the majority of persons all over the globe to lower incomes, more hunger and poverty, increased environmental pollution, increased exposure to disease, more conflict. The major problem, of course, is that as exponential growth becomes harder and harder to maintain, then measures that guarantee a steady rate of return to investors must become even more draconian. And I fear, given what's going to happen this year with the coronavirus, because basically this is what happened in 2007, 2008, is that after things started coming back, the investors got their money first. And they got money that they had to even take from everybody else. In fact, for the first time, actually, the general population did not and has not returned to their previous states. So that's it. Thanks for giving me the option to do that. But understand what I try to do with this is present a view of the economy, and to some extent try out a view of the economy that would articulate how it works well enough to counter any idea that a debt action or a debt strike is somehow immoral or impossible. Because I agree with Joshua that I think there will be a debt strike. The only question is, when and where.
Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Thank you so much, Richard. That was really wonderful. So much to take in there. I want to just see if folks have questions, for Richard, clarification or comments or anything at all. Richard, maybe you could stop your screen share.
Yeah.
So that we could see each other a little bit more easily.
There you go.
Questions or comments? Alex, are you trying to get in here again? Yeah.
Can I just go one more time? So
Yep.
Getting back to my very first question of, you mentioned the overall statistic of about $250 trillion in global debt.
Right.
Do we know how much of that 250 trillion is accumulated interest? Is there any kind of information on that out there? I don't know, this might just be a non-issue.
The information out there, what you'd have to do is sort of country by country.
Yeah.
For example, Jamaica is still paying off, they're paying 9 times what they borrowed.
Yeah.
And part of it was they had to readjust their payments in order to, and so essentially we're getting the payments deferred, paying only the interest. But again, the interest piled up. But that's a good question. And I think you can probably find it for individual countries. A wonderful book called Odious Debt that gets into, some of that. And that deals with sovereign debt in Africa and the consequences of having to pay that debt in terms of health, child mortality, and so on.
Hi, this is Andy. I do have a question. I'm curious, a lot of this, the sort of facts and figures you're laying out about debt and the way the world economy works, it's easy to sort of just assume that this is all driven essentially by greed, you might imagine. But I guess I wonder if you could talk a little bit more towards like the incentives around both like this way of living with a global economy versus whether there are sort of at an institutional global political level, like conversations happening about other ways that this could, these kind of issues could be managed, comparing like the IMF work, for instance. I'm sure there are some people who think, yes, these are necessary institutions, while other people think they're merely, parasites. So I just wonder how that works, like for the incentives on either side.
I'm hesitant to say greed. I mean, first of all, I'm an anthropologist. And one, I don't want to attribute motivation. But my colleague, Tim DeMuzio, and I've done a couple of books together, wrote another book called The 1% and the Rest of Us. And there's a culture there that, one, justifies their incredible wealth. As Bernie Sanders said, why should anybody have $1 billion? I mean, it's 1,000 million. That justifies it and sees it as necessary. And I think when you get locked into the world of investment capital, and there is some anthropological work on that, you see the world differently. And you don't see yourself as being greedy. You see yourself simply as doing what you're supposed to. Now, Tim also had this great distinction that they made between what he called the logic of livelihood, that is wanting to earn enough to live, and to live at a certain standard, and the logic of accumulation, where the only logic is really to get more and more and more. And essentially what you see dominating, certainly in most of the investment world, is the logic of accumulation. I hope that sort of gets at one of the questions you're talking about.
Yeah, I think so. I guess the other aspect of it was on the other side, if there are conversations happening amongst world leaders, say, and maybe being in the US, I'm particularly in a vacuum away from these things, but to try to, kind of turn that tide a bit.
Yeah, it's mostly fluff. I mean, there's a big thing now. In fact, I saw I participated in a seminar with Gillian Tett, who anthropologist, columnist for the Financial Times. And they have a new thing called moral money. And there's a lot of talk, especially among investment counselors, of moral investing, the green investing, the impact investing, they usually call it. And this is investing in which you're trying to actually deal with problems. Now, aside from the fact that a lot of the problems you're dealing with, you're still trying to get an equitable rate of return. But there's only $500 billion of that by the best estimates out there. I mean, 500 billion compared to 350 trillion, you're talking about 2 or 3% of all investments are these so-called moral investments. That's what largely they're talking about, I think.
Just to expand this particular question about how governance and global governance is or is not tied into this particular form of accumulation or not. I wanted to ask Allison to make a comment from her perspective, because I think it may speak to some of your concerns, Andy. I mean, I want to preface this by saying, from something like a traditional Marxist perspective, I guess, sure, it doesn't have to be the case that the state or the global governance is so tightly bound up with, accumulative or speculative finance. But it certainly has been now for several hundred years. And we certainly have institutions of surveillance and control and discipline of populations that are so deeply tied into this that I think it certainly would be much more it would be much more than sort of, I think, leaders thinking of all alternative possibilities, although obviously we would want them to do that, and us too, but I think that we're up against quite an embedded system of social order that it even goes beyond what Richard mentioned in terms of the culture of the 1% or whatever too. And Devin is going to speak to those issues of power and governmentality by means of finance in a minute. But Allison, would you maybe speak to those issues for a minute?
Sure. So my focus just for the last 3 years has really been around social impact investing, which I think is sort of what we're bumping around in this space. And it is very much an intentional structure that has had a long run up. And in many ways, I think the crisis of 2008 really prepared the ground for what's coming. And in terms of destabilizing large parts of the community, making people more economically insecure, housing insecure, because this new system runs on poverty. And if I know we mentioned BlackRock, if I would just recommend, and I dropped a bunch of links in, but if you look at the Impact Management Project, a lot of the new stakeholder capitalism that was rolled out and launched in Davos in January, actually it started in Philadelphia. It has Philadelphia ties specifically to the Rockefeller Foundation and Judith Rodin, and the B Lab, which is setting all the numbers for it, is out in Berwyn. So this infrastructure and apparatus has been waiting for a trigger event, which I believe that this is, but it's so big it's hard to talk about. Essentially, if you look to the World Bank and the IMF and how they interface with the Sustainable Development Goals through the United Nations, most of those goals are actually anti-poverty. They don't actually have anything to do with land or climate or water. There's like 4 or 5 of the 17 that have to do with that. The rest are human capital management. And global investors, through the idea of good capitalism, have aligned to these goals of investing, but it's all data driven and it all relies on a very robust system of data analytics and Internet of Things that is coming down that also parallels surveillance capitalism. And it's tied in with digital identity systems that may be tied to these vaccine certificates. You can look it up, self-sovereign digital identity. There's hundreds of organizations, blockchain organizations that are setting these up, that you can be your own investable commodity, how you interface in smart environments. And essentially, justifying good capitalism means we're going to kill the planet by putting satellite constellations and bombarding everything with radiation and extracting all of the lithium from Bolivia and cobalt from Congo to run these sensors for global capital. So I think the idea that it just happened or people just think that they're doing a good thing is a little naive, because these systems, which are inherently tied with the military state, like if we didn't have drone policing and robot police dogs and things to keep everyone in line, there would be time to rise up. And I think my question is, like, for us, as we think about these new systems and strikes, is what does a strike look like in this moment before the full-on, like, automated police state comes online? And just even within these spaces, this is all signals intelligence that is building the AI, right? Like, this is all feeding through the Minerva project and the DARPA systems to sort of track how we're responding. I feel like this is a shock event to see, like, here's a shock, how do they react? And then the next wave, it gets factored in. So anyway, I don't think that there is good stakeholder capitalism is not the way, but they've planned it for a long time.
Thank you, Allison. And if folks are interested in this, this conversation is going to unfold, but Allison's going to be doing a seminar through Insight and Online on her research in the next few weeks, so you can hear more on this. But Richard or Devin, did you want to maybe respond to anything Allison's bringing forward, or Andy? I don't know how that speaks to some of your concerns, but anybody else want to make a comment? Richard? Yeah.
Yeah, I say only I think that, and again, as I posed the problem initially, how do you articulate the issues enough to get people on board with something like a debt action? And I think, again, it's the tyranny of the rate of return. That's the number that essentially is driving virtually all government policy. And I want to hear, more to some extent on the role of the state in this, because I say the state is one of the major investors, essentially, or debtors, certainly, that has a vested interest in maintaining it and all that power. And, this is why I think, some of the things, Devin has done, reveals that correspondence. And so everything, again, I think most of the problems that we have can be traced back to this idea of the tyranny of the rate of return. And I guess in terms of a marketing sense, one question I'm asking, and you can give me some response in the chat, is does a notion like that effectively grab people's attention enough to listen, to hear a different version of how the economy is structured.
Yeah, that's right. Anyone else? Responses, comments?
Yeah,
Adam, it's you. Yeah.
Richard, as someone who's read Debt as Power a couple of times and through the years have wrestled really with this question of how do you organize around a debt action or a debt strike, and I like part of the conversation that consistently comes up is the moral frame, the moralizing of debts and debt repayment. And then there's another conversation that I have after I have that one, which is if our debts are backed up essentially by the sovereign debt is mostly backed up by the military, like AKA the major enterprise of violence in the globe, then our like what is sometimes framed as a moral question is really a question about how do you avoid violence, right? Like the action of a debt strike is nonviolent, but people's concerns are first forms of economic violence in the form of evictions and foreclosures. And then, you know, if you really do try to just squat in wherever you're at, like in the case of if the debt strike happened due to the housing market crisis, well, how long is it before the cops come and pull you out of your house? Mm-hmm. So it's like it would be nice to think for a lot of people that our morality is backed up by a sincere desire to do what's right. It seems like neoliberal morality is really just backed up by violence. It's very stark. And so while I think the problem for me is like, it's easy to think about this as a question of an ideological shift that needs to happen in relationship to our debts. But in all honesty, when the rubber meets the road on a debt action, it is really about strategies of avoiding violence, and that's where I think where the real buy-in happens. And so I say that, I know that's not a question. My question to you was, in part of your book, you cover like what are the real repercussions of not paying your debt, for instance, for a month or 2 months or 3 months. And talking about those, I think kind of bring light to we're too quick to guess or think that what will happen in response to a debt action is immediate physical violence. And it really actually won't likely play out that way. It'll play out in a different way. So
and just very quickly, I actually want to hear from Devin. But the debt strike idea, of course, is modeled after the labor strike. And it took labor, well over a century to effectively organize enough to strike. If 3 or 4 workers said, we don't want this, we're not going to work anymore, back in 1850 in some textile factory, forget about it. They're going to get thrown out of the building. When by the 1930s and 40s, certainly, with Roosevelt's New Deal, with the Labor Relations Board established, the right to organize and strike recognized for the most part, labor had the power to do that. And they were able to some extent, create a situation where you had as much equality, certainly economic inequality, as you ever had in the United States in that period from 1940s, 1950s, 1960s. So that's what you have to model it after. And if enough people don't pay their mortgage, there's no way banks can repossess. They couldn't repossess all the defaults in 2007, 2008. Plus the fact banks don't want to disqualify that many people, because who would they lend money to after that? So once in effect, and we came up with a sort of a rough estimate of about 20% of the population, figuring 10% are in default at any given time anyway. But if 20% of the population would join in simply withholding, I'm not saying not paying, withholding their debt in the same way that workers withheld their labor, unless certain conditions were met. And you have to, of course, specify the conditions. Otherwise, it makes no sense. And so you started out, say, in the United States with a debt strike to change campaign finance laws. There's really not much the state can do at that point if you've got 20, 30% of the population withholding their debt, their money. And they then somehow will recognize, as they did with labor for at least a short period of time, that debtors have power. And the other point we made in debt as capital, or debt as power rather, is that, essentially, the state has to then negotiate. There's a power that they recognize that they can negotiate with. And part of this also is based on the fact that labor, certainly in the United States, is no longer powerful, has very little power. Europe, I think, quite a bit more. Certainly in Germany, workers' rights are far more adhered to than in the United States. But my point is, you have to model it after the idea of the labor strike. And if you're disheartened that it can't happen tomorrow, again, it took over 100 years for labor to finally gain the power to do that. Hopefully it won't be that long.
Just a quick, I want to let other folks in here, but just a quick precursor to, I think, what Devin will talk about too, is that this is one of the reasons why, even though most of us need tremendous debt forgiveness in the short term and should get it, a debt jubilee or a general debt forgiveness would not really change the status quo of power relations. It would leave the creditor classes and banking classes as they are and who they are in relation to the state. It would just sort of reset the game. And so the part of the argument of debt as power is that a debt strike or withholding of payments is strategically very different from the demand for debt cancellation, even though the demand for the cancellation could become part of the platform. And if you don't mind, just really quickly here, Richard, I thought I would share the screen. I actually showed this last time, but this was their sort of potential platform. Obviously, we could debate this. There'd be disagreement about what we want to put forward, but in the same way that a labor movement would put forward its demands and the conditions under which it would return to work, something like this, or would be what we might stipulate as the basis of ever returning to making payments or something. So I thought
you would not ask for all 12 at once.
Yeah, no, of course not. Yeah.
But the other point, just quickly, is this is all based too on the idea that we've no longer become, in a Marxian sense, divided between capital and labor. That we simply become divided by debtors and creditors, and that has become that's essentially the new point of conflict or integration, and that the debt strike is not intended solely as a one-time thing. You're essentially then recognizing the power of debtors, who are as responsible, in fact, more responsible for the functioning of the economy than anybody else, in the same way that labor was. And so you're looking at a long-term shift in terms of a balance of power, which we have almost completely lost over the past 30 or 40 years, largely through what are called neoliberal policies.
Yeah, exactly. Does anybody want to make another comment? I feel like, Devin, we're really setting you up now for, I think, what you want to say about the state and sovereignty in relation to debt. But what I want to propose actually is we take a very short 5-minute break before we do that, so folks can stretch their legs and chill. But again, before I do that, does anybody have a last question or comment on anything Richard said so far before we take a quick break? Obviously, we'll have a lot more time to talk all this through the second half.
I have a quick question.
Carlos, yeah.
So something I noticed that's come up maybe 2 or 3 times was this sort of idea of like justification or morality involved in maintaining the system. And I mean, I wonder if maybe Devin and Joshua might eventually talk to this, is that I wonder if maybe like the prosperity theology might play a part in maintaining the system. And I guess I sort of just wonder if people have any general ideas about that.
Yeah, that's going to be a big part of what I'm going to talk about, actually.
Yeah,
the morality and the kind of existential philosophical aspects to this. That's a great point, very important one. So I do plan to touch on that.
I think Jimmy, you had your hand up.
Yes, I did. Quick comment about your presentation, Richard. Phenomenal. Same with you, Joshua. And my question was about something small you cited with Paul Kruger, a co-author. I was just asking about it. I wanted to find it and read it myself.
Do you mean Krugman?
Krugman, yeah.
Paul Krugman, yeah. It's a 2006 article, and if I can get your email somehow, Jimmy, I'll send you, I'll send you the reference. Or in fact, while we break here, I can go get it and I'll put it on the screen. Or in fact, I'm sorry, I'll send it to you through chat during the break.
Yeah, put it on the chat, then everyone can see it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sounds good.
Okay, so if there aren't any further comments, let's take, really quick 5 minutes. Folks do what they need to do, and then we'll reconvene. We'll start with Devin, take it from there. Thanks, everybody. Going to turn it over to Devin now to sort of broaden this conversation in a couple of different ways, both historically. Devin's work is on the longer history of the relations between debt and money and state power, and also in particular the way that theological discourses, Christianity in particular, has both borrowed from and been influenced by the discourse of economics, at least since the Roman Empire. So there's a lot of perspective here that is available from history, and really something that I think is important for all of us to sit with is that I would say that the very language of economics has become sort of for us what theology was maybe in the medieval era, or for an earlier era of Western civilization. It's almost impossible to speak about reality in a way that gets taken seriously unless you use the discourse and language of economics. But as people like Michael Hudson and others have shown, this renders a lot of economic language opaque and mystificatory, and means that we're often talking about religion and metaphysics and belief and morality when we're apparently talking about numbers. So Devin's an amazing guide to sort of the history of this and its contemporary iterations. And so Devin, anything you have to share with us now would be awesome. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Joshua. I really appreciate the invitation. It's great to be with all of you here. Thanks for all of you for hopping on for this discussion. I'm going to shift perspectives a bit, and I do want to talk about some sort of larger, perhaps more abstract or theoretical issues, but also some historical issues. And I don't have a lovely PowerPoint prepared. I apologize for that. So I'm just going to make a few comments here, and I'll keep it hopefully succinct. And
well, you're lovely, Devin, so we'll take that.
Thank you. And I like to be dialogical, so I don't like to hear myself speak for too long. So feel free to interject with questions to kind of prompt me in different directions. That's fine too. So I want to talk about sources. So what's been intriguing me as of late in terms of my current work is to understand what are some of the sources of debt's power in our lives, conceptually, theoretically, existentially, socially, and politically. So Richard just provided us with a wonderful exploration statistically and economically from the point of view of the kind of power that debt seems to have. And I'm interested in looking at some of the historical reasons behind that, but also just why does debt appear to have such a hold on our imaginations and on our existence, such that some contemporary philosophers can talk about even our ontology, our sense of self is somehow as an indebted subject, right? What is that all about? And that's what's fascinating me as of late. And there's two areas I want to touch on today, and these are two intuitions that I have, two senses that I have in terms of where some of this power comes from. There's obviously plenty of sources that we can highlight and signal in terms of the origins of debt's power in our lives. Two that I want to review here. One is the ways that we actually speak about debt and speak very vaguely about debt when we often mean other kinds of obligation and bond socially, culturally, and politically. And I'll say more about that in a second. But so I want to talk about kind of concepts and language in terms of how we speak about debt. And then a particular merger that's happened in history between debt language on one hand and moral, spiritual, or religious language on the other. The ways that debt has been integrated into a religious imagination that has profoundly shaped civilizations, and I'm thinking particularly of Western civilizations as kind of the standpoint of analysis, but we can, always, of course, always do comparative work on other trajectories as well. So in terms of the first point about speaking vaguely about debt, what do I mean? I mean that we often use terms like being indebted or being in debt to one another to mean other kinds of things. And so we might use an expression like, I have a debt of gratitude to somebody, or to say that we feel in debt to somebody when we really mean something else. Right now, my claim is that there's a larger sort of master category that's obligation, which is this larger sense of what it means to be bound to somebody, whether it's an individual or a community or even a nation or a group in some way, to feel obligated in some way where there's perhaps reciprocity or at least a sense of wanting to return something in some way. Within that umbrella of obligation, there are other types of bonds. Debt is one that we'll talk about, but there's something that I'm calling loyalty, which would be a sense of being, feeling obligated to people on perhaps on a horizontal plane with family, friends, and loved ones. And then we can also talk about fealty in terms of perhaps a more vertical sense of obligation, being obligated to some sorts of the sense of higher authorities or powers, whether they're political, whether they're divine, spiritual, whether they're temporal in a sense of ancestors or those who kind of preceded us. I think we do ourselves a disservice when we use debt to mark and codify these kinds of obligations. And so part of my intuition is that we've allowed debt to sort of overflow its banks, if you will, from this category of marking a certain kind of relationship, and it's colonized and flooded into our imaginations how we then think about how we relate to one another. And so sometimes even in conversations like this, the question will arise, well, aren't there, don't we have to honor some debts? Aren't there some ways of being indebted to one another that are good? And that reveals, I think, this kind of blurriness that we need to get a hold of, where there are kinds of obligations that we, of course, want to honor, obligations that we feel to one another socially. But when we name those as debt, there's something that's problematic there. So my desire is that when we speak about debt, that we keep it sort of sequestered to an economic realm, and in particular to debt specifically as a notion of an exchange of some sort of resource or material value that then has an explicit agreement about some kind of return that's going to be made at some sort of point. So there's an exchange of value, and there is an explicit agreement in terms of how that value is going to be returned, and there's some sort of witness, whether it's a community, a contract, an oath, something that attests to this publicly in some way, that can then also enforce it in some way, again, by law, by tradition, by the community. That also helps us distinguish between debt and gifts. And gifts is another topic that comes up often in these kinds of conversations, and it has some sort of historical proximity to it. One of the stories of the emergence of debt that I think has some plausibility, at least it makes sense to me, is that we can imagine that in archaic, so-called primitive, or at least hunter-gatherer communities, that there are modes of exchange that have been called gift exchange, where there is forms of reciprocity of giving and receiving resources with one another, where there are understandings of obligation to return, but they're implicit. They're implicit within the community. They're implicit in its cultures and traditions. And they're in some sense just understood in terms of the ways that the communities interact and behave. Debt appears, at least one logical explanation for debt, or compelling explanation, is that debt is an attempt to render explicit and render public these kinds of implicit understandings in terms of the ways that we reciprocate with one another according to the logic of gift. And so one might imagine this happening when there's a merger of two communities where there are different exchange cultures. And so giving a gift to one community, one might not be aware or sure about whether or not it's going to be reciprocated. Or how, whether or not it's going to be, on what terms, at what time frame, et cetera. And so we can imagine debt as dealing ambiguity and the ambivalence around gift exchange to stipulate it and to enforce it and make sure that it happens. So that's one possibility, is that different communities of different gift traditions, or those that are experiencing some kind of internal diversity or diversification, where there are different types of reciprocities happening, but there's a desire to then stipulate and make sure that everyone's in agreement. Another link possible that brings in the state and sovereignty is that it's actually some sort of authority figure, the sovereign, who wants to actually stabilize exchange relationships within a territory, and to make sure that people are giving and exchanging on the terms, on the accounting system and the weights and measures that the sovereign establishes to enforce that and standardize that. There are, of course, problems with this story of the origins of debt, and in particular relating it to gift. Part of the issue, and David Graeber more recently has raised this as an issue, and other anthropologists, Marshall Salins as well. But the studying of so-called primitive communities today doesn't necessarily tell us anything about 10,000 years ago, 12,000 years ago, when human communities were shifting from hunter-gatherer to agrarian systems. And so there's been an assumption that one can study sort of communities that we imagine have been frozen in time since then, and that this will tell us what human communities were like before the agrarian revolution. And there are good reasons to challenge that and to be unsure about that. So the part of the problem, of course, is historical record, and we just don't have access to what exchange relationships were like before the invention of certain kinds of recording instruments. And one of the earliest ones was debt tabulation instruments on clay tablets from the 3000s before the Common Era in the ancient Near East. So we know that debt, as we understand it, in terms of a formal agreement that has some kind of witness and can be enforced in some way, is on the scene then. And it's linked to the rise of states. It's linked to these first agrarian empires that are able to amass a surplus of typically grain, and we can talk about this as well in terms of why grain is important to this story. But to create a surplus and to manipulate and subjugate labor and to create that surplus. Debt is one of the ways that has been used to entrap and motivate labor. And we can talk about the various uses of debt, but one of the most common ones throughout its history was actually to motivate labor. So it wasn't simply about lending to try to get money back on interest, although that's often, that's how we think of it today. And that was a use for debt, was to try to make money off the interest. But a predominant use of debt in the ancient world was to actually motivate labor. Labor was the scarce resource. And so you could create debt slaves by loaning at an exorbitant rate, and one was not able to pay that back. And so instead they labored and toiled for you to work off that principal. Usually it was not possible to pay it off. And so they were indebted for their lives. And often that indebtedness can then pass on to their descendants as well.
Devin, it could also be due to some kind of injury or conflict between parties as well. Like if my family injured or even killed a member of your family, you could then take one of my family members as a debt slave or debt peon, right? So I'm just invoking that because I think it's one really important aspect of this is to realize that to be in debt is partly shameful because it could represent a kind of unpaid fine or unpaid penalty on someone's part that you you haven't made yourself back into a sort of upstanding member of the community. I just wanted to add that in. Keep going.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, that was literally the next line on my little notes here was the concept of what's called weregild.
Exactly.
Which is this notion that many cultures have, where one can provide some kind of compensation for an insult or injury. This is, of course, where the famous notion of an eye for an eye or a tooth for a tooth comes from, is this emergence in culture of this idea that one wrong can be balanced out either with a very identical wrong, an identical kind of injury or violence in the case of an eye for an eye, or with a substitute. And even this, I mean, I think is remarkable, and we kind of glance over it quickly because we're so used to this. But the notion that human communities could evolve conceptually, the idea that if I accidentally cut off your arm, I can give you 3 bags of grain, and that somehow equals your arm. Right? Like this conceptual work that we've evolved as humans to do to substitute something for something else is actually really profound and not self-evident. But there's a kind of a measurement and proportionality that has been created that is really very interesting, that is connected to this as well. The idea of a substitute or a compensation in some way. One of the theories of the origins of money is that states then came in and tried to stabilize these various kinds of weregild relationships. You can imagine various communities having different, basically barter or haggling in terms of trying to agree how to compensate members for injuries or insults and agreeing on some sort of proportion for that. But these would be all very idiosyncratic and localized and diverse. But when a sovereign emerges and tries to control a territory, they want to standardize these relationships. And this is one theory about the origins for a kind of standard accounting system that would then be a precursor to monetary relationships. In terms of, and this also links up with the idea of guilt. So debt and guilt are highly correlated and related. And this is a longstanding issue. And one of the things that we want to talk about as well today, why is it that to be in debt often is associated with being somehow guilty, like morally suspect, morally culpable in some way, right? There are concerns about this. Why should debtors feel shame? Why should debtors be guilty? And there's millennia of correlation between this language. And one of those comes from what Joshua brought up, this notion of, often a debt is something that you've incurred through injuring somebody, so you need to atone for it in some way. But also we see debt language being used in religious traditions to speak about sin and a kind of moral or spiritual guilt before God or before other kinds of divine figures. And so this is one of the main trajectories that I've looked at and what I'm interested in, because this is kind of one of the main sort of conduits, if you will, of a lot of this ancient Near Eastern debt language into the contemporary world, partly through biblical language and through the use of scripture and Jewish and Christian traditions that have shaped the imaginations in the West. And a lot of our language around indebtedness and guilt comes from these traditions. And so that's part of why I feel like it's been important to explicate that and understand that. And there's a lot that we can say about this. I'll just say I'm happy to expand on it. But in brief, the notion of being in sin, there's a scholar, Gary Anderson, who has a great short book called Sin, A History, that I'd recommend if you're interested in this. But he documents the ways that in the Hebrew scriptures, sin initially was construed as a kind of stain or a weight. The metaphors for sin were a stain that could be washed through some kind of ritual cleansing, but that it migrates to then language of debt, that debt becomes the metaphor for one metaphor for sin becomes construed as debt. And so a sinner is a debtor before God. And as is typical, the sin debtor is unable to repay that debt and requires some sort of act of forgiveness on the part of the heavenly creditor. And so Jubilee language, this language of debt cancellation, then also becomes spiritualized. So whereas we could maybe think of it as a political and economic act of forgiving debts that the sovereign undertakes, now God can also be depicted as somebody who decrees Jubilee for God's people and forgives these debts. And of course, Jesus takes up this language and uses it very self-consciously as he's depicted in the Gospels. And we can talk a lot about the use of this language in Christian tradition. One of the things I did want to mention, partly because Joshua brought up issues of prison abolition. So one of the things that certainly doesn't only come from Christianity, but Christianity has profoundly shaped our societies, and thinking about it, is the merger of language of sacrifice and suffering on one hand with economy and compensation and repayment on the other. The language of Christ being slaughtered or killed as a blood offering to pay back or to buy back humanity, which is a very common set of metaphors that actually mixes metaphors and brings together two different kinds of relationships. One is a sacrificial way of relating, which doesn't need to be about compensation or economy, but Christianity makes it so. And there's a trajectory one can draw from this idea to then a later notion of penance and suffering within the medieval church, this idea of one's pain being something that one can pay back or atone in some way for one's sins, to then contributing to the carceral imagination and the suffering, whether in prison or in some way, as a way to pay back one's debt to society, one's debt as a criminal. There's a genealogy there that I think we can trace that I think is important as well. And so part of it, I'm not saying it's as simple as it's all from Christianity. There's a lot happening there, but I think that's a major meta narrative there that can be explicated. We can talk we can talk about the scholastics and prohibitions of usury. I'm happy to get into that as well, but and usury laws that are still on the books. But Jeremy Bentham is sort of credited with one of the people who sort of a early modern defender of usury. Basically, his text In Defense of Usury attacks pre-existing scholastic and Christian theological defenses of some sort of either prohibition of usury or some kind of notion of just price. And Bentham constructs what remains today one of the major arguments in favor of indebtedness, which is just a notion of free consent, the idea that indebtedness should be fine and that usury should be fine at whatever rates, because whoever's getting into it consents to it. And so if you agree with somebody to sell yourself into some kind of debt peonage in some way, then that's your freedom as an individual. And this is what, of course, gets bandied about within ideologies of the free market and sort of atomistic notions of the free individual today that don't take into account social embeddedness, that don't take into account hidden forms of coercion, that don't ask questions about whether starvation is a kind of coercion and whether one needing to borrow to not starve really counts as pure, lovely freedom in the way that Bentham construes it, right? So there are problems there.
By the way, because I invoke the distinction between borrowing to household or provision and borrowing to speculate, I want to make sure folks see that that's exactly what we're talking about here, right? It's the whole question of whether borrowing to survive should really count or even make sense to be thought of as borrowing. If what you're doing, when you lend is speculating, for a rate of return, there's an asymmetry there, right, between the position of the lender and of the borrower. Anyway, I just wanted to make sure people made that connection.
Absolutely, yeah, it's a great connection, and yeah, one can think of that there's arguably there are some ameliorative sort of uses for debt if it's used in a simple sense of lending to help somebody not starve, and if debt was ever sort of not condemned in the ancient world, it was for that use alone, that one could lend to a neighbor at a reasonable rate, or maybe not even at a sort of without interest, but as a way to just help them out and prevent them from starving. But then we see all these other uses for debt that then build upon that. This notion of debt as extractive, where I'm going to lend because I actually want to make money off you paying back interest. Debt as expropriative, which is what I talked about in terms of trying to entrap labor and motivate labor and expropriate their labor through debt slavery. And then also productive and speculative ideas of debt, which are much more modern and relate to partly to what Joshua was saying of debt as a way to fund an enterprise, lending capital to a business or an enterprise, or speculative debt, which is basically what dominates on the global scene right now through derivatives and other forms of debt instruments, which is lending for the sake of some sort of return that often hides its connections to labor and the exploitation of labor. One can also tell an important story about the shift from speaking of this issue of sovereignty and the state to debt, monarchs and emperors in the ancient world typically were understood, or at least seen, as a kind of creditor to their community. They maintained a treasury and they loaned out or they disseminated their tokens, namely coins, that regulated the economy and that were rendered back through taxation. And there was a way in which the sovereign was construed as the one who had the resources that then gave it to the community, and then retracted those through taxation. Obviously, that's one level. We can talk about the ways the sovereign is always still indebted to that community, in terms of it's the one that the sovereign requires that community to sort of launch it into a position of power or leadership, or through a form of conquest. But the shift that happens in the High Middle Ages is the shift to an understanding of the sovereign as the one who can be permanently indebted. So in the ancient world, kings certainly borrowed periodically to fund different wars and whatnot, but it was not seen as acceptable for the sovereign to be permanently in debt. Through a lot of argumentation, a number of which were actually scholastics and others in the Christian tradition, there became a defense of the idea of the prince or the leader of the state as being in debt for the sake of the common good. So there's a theological argument that actually contributes to the idea that Richard so powerfully showed of the modern state being a permanent state of debt, that it's a debt-funded state. And this is basically the norm in the modern era, and this is how we understand capitalist states, is that they are debt-funded. But there's a shift that happens. So I think it's important to note that and recognize that, and also to talk about the theological and other philosophical arguments that help justify that kind of permanent indebtedness on the part of the state. I also wanted to comment briefly about this idea of growth and endless growth, because it's something that Richard touched on a lot, and just talk about a shift that also occurred. So we can find it in Plato and Aristotle and others in the ancient world, particularly among Stoics, that there's a concern about money, explicitly about fueling unlimited desire. And this kind of limitlessness that money provokes is actually a grave concern. And that in these classical kinds of economies, there's a concern about proportionality, balance, and cycles of growth and degrowth, and that's accepted and fine. But something happens in terms of theorizing and thinking about the economy that then brings in ideas of limitless or unlimited growth, or growth moving in at least one direction or trajectory. And again, there are many sources to this, but a couple ones that I think are interesting theologically. One was brought up by a scholar, Dotan Lesham, has a book called The Origins of Neoliberalism. Maybe Joshua can drop that in the notes as well, which is another important, interesting genealogy that deals with some ancient classical works in theology about this. But he talks about how there's actually a Christian notion of the believer on a journey with God, growing exponentially, in a sense of merging with the infinite, of becoming godlike in some sense. Obviously not becoming God, but there's a strand of Christianity that talks about deification and the trajectory of the believer as being open to the infinite in some way. And so there's a genealogy that can be drawn there of language of being open to the infinite, of continually growing in Christ and continually multiplying the spiritual returns, that the blessings that have been given by God, that sets up a kind of imagination for an openness to the future, an openness to unlimited growth as well. And there are some other philosophical sources there that I can go into that I won't now. I also wanted to link, though, the language of interests with reproduction. This was also has been done for centuries, this idea that money generating itself through interest is a kind of reproduction. And Aristotle very famously remarked that this is an unnatural reproduction. And so his arguments against usury, his arguments against charging interest, were that money shouldn't reproduce itself. That's not natural, that it's, natural things should reproduce themselves. And so I just wanted to flag that there are also interesting ideologies about reproduction that are at play here. When we want to either critique interest, challenge interests, think about it in different ways. Yeah, Joshua.
Just, thank you, Devin. This is so rich. I want to make a couple of quick connections. One is that in the chat we were talking about the rate of interest, and Richard mentioned that generally what justifies the rate of interest is what's perceived to be the value of time. And of course, and I was saying earlier that you know, that always has to be some kind of natural or generational sense of like, you know, what a life is or what a generation is or something that is then, you know, chopped up, and people put their expectations on what is needed, you know, over time to come up with the, you know, the discount rate or whatever it is that you know, justifies the people making investments in one another. I understand there's a long tradition of sort of relying on that in economic theory to ground the rate of interest, but I always was very suspicious of it. I mean, I think it's I mean, okay, 7%, but why not 17? You know, like, you know, what's that's something to talk about. But you're making an interesting point here, is that oftentimes when and this is going to connect to Allison's work, is that oftentimes when we try to use something like the state, or use our sense of what's reasonable or rational, like Aristotle did, right, to expect from an economy, we're not really interrupting sovereignty. We're just kind of falling back on some image of the family or image of what a normal community is, or an idealized image of, you know, kind of like what life is, right? That can be equally dangerous or damaging, or constraining in some way for our imaginations, right? I mean, I'm going a little bit quickly here. I think you can see where I'm going with this, but the idea is that, you know, we often think, well, if we could just get out of the speculative kind of runaway train that money puts us on, we'd end up with something more reasonable. But often our sense of what's reasonable for a household then ends up reifying notions of like family or organic communities or the nation or some other kind of thing. And this is I think what Allison's worried about in her work, which is that, you know, if we start to index people's behavior and monitor their lives in some really intensive way to supposedly support them, right? We could be moving from, you know, the kind of freewheeling insanity of speculative capital to a kind of, you know, a level of eugenics and biopower and necropower that is completely, you know, terrifying to even countenance. So that was just a way of kind of triangulating some things that were going on in the chat with what you're saying. You can speak to any of that if you want. I know you've got more to say about sovereignty and stuff, but I just wanted to like do that for a minute.
Yeah, that was really rich, and that raises a lot of things. I mean, it makes me think a lot about social reproduction discussions and Marxist feminist critique that is so crucial and so important, and, you know, highlights the ways that there's so much invisible labor that sustains not just the economy, but intergenerationally, which is part of what you brought up as well. You know, if people are interested in this, Nancy Fraser's work, Silvia Federici's work as well. I mean, these are some key theorists that have done this. So there's a movement called Wages for Housework, which raises this issue as well, with whether or not and to what extent we should put a price on the labor of the domus, of the household, or not. And obviously that raises problems as well, some of the ones that you named in terms of a kind of higher level of biopolitics and surveillance of putting a price on that labor, but at the same time it actually makes it visible and renders it visible. But there's a way that capitalism, and there's another great book that's an easy intro into this if you're interested in this, called Who Cooked Adam Smith's Dinner, which is a wonderful accessible read about the blindness of neoclassical economy to the very notion that the so-called homo economicus that's out there, you know, bartering and trading and investing, is actually a real human that's being reproduced in the household through somebody who's cooking for him, providing for him, giving him birth, nurturing him, the affective labor that's crucial as well, that's missed in all of this. And arguably this is also where, you know, a lot of the rate of return comes through. It's through exploitation of labor, so through labor not being compensated for its full value, and so that profit gets extracted and becomes part of what, thinking about classical Marxist theory of the M prime, the money that reproduces itself partly through extracting labor and not paying it, but also through this invisible labor, the labor of the household, the labor of typically women, but those that are somehow unseen in the economy, that are not being compensated. And so that reserve gets to then go back to investors who then think of it as the miracle of compound interest, when it's actually really, again, labor not being fully compensated for its work.
I put up a YouTube link to a recent lecture by Graeber on this point, Devin. It's called from managerial feudalism to the revolt of the caring classes, and he's making this point that the caring economy and the reparative and restorative economy is absolutely enormous in comparison to the productive economy. You know, he uses the example of, like, it takes a little bit of energy to make a plate, but then it gets washed, you know, like thousands of times over its lifetime, right? So the actual energy that's going into repair and restoration is massive by comparison with, you know, with production itself. So anyway, just connected to that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I did want to note I invoked Aristotle in this kind of critique of so-called unnatural reproduction. And obviously that's in some ways that there's a, you know, as we think about and reflect on various ways to challenge exorbitant debt or something we might call usury. I mean, Aristotle was certainly used by the Christian scholastics as a way to do this. But there is, of course, a problematic trajectory there of asserting something called natural reproduction, right, over against unnatural, which then can become a very problematic form of policing of the kinds of licit and illicit forms of reproduction that are acceptable. So there may be a way, and I've tried to play with this a bit in some papers and some articles, but there may be a way that this actual dichotomy that Aristotle sets up between natural and unnatural reproduction actually reinforces it and enables this kind of world of unnatural interest to really sort of make the most of things. And so there might be a way to actually collapse and challenge that binary rather than try to reassert even more strongly that there's something called natural reproduction that's somehow right and true and grounded in nature over against something that's unnatural. I mean, there's something very problematic in that. So we need to be careful with that kind of language.
Absolutely. I just want to check in with everybody. This has been so rich, and I know there's a lot coming forward right now. So do folks have questions for clarification, comments? I definitely want you to keep going, Devin, but let's just kind of check in. How are folks doing? Jim, I feel like you might have something to say about this. I don't know why, Jim Wetzel, but or anybody else wants to make a comment. Alex Wilson, yeah.
Yeah. Well, thanks to Devin and Richard for those great talks, and I'm just trying to put them together in my mind. What the question that I have is more kind of bringing it back to a kind of a strategic or maybe tactical question about whether if you do a debt strike, what happens afterwards. And so early on, Joshua was talking about primitive accumulation and how, you know, that it doesn't just happen naturally, it happens through violence and through extraction and dividing the population in these arbitrary ways and stuff. And that's also in Silvia Federici. And this process keeps going, right? It never really stops. It just moves around and it changes geographically where it is, but it's happening constantly, this extraction of value from individuals. So how do you get ahead of that? Because you already see it kind of happening, you know, after the, you know, I see it in the rise of nationalism in the last 10 years. You kind of see capitalism is kind of, it knows it's falling apart, and you see this kind of creation of more divisions and more kind of return to kind of racist nationalist politics here and there in the Western world. So how do you get ahead? It's kind of a tactical question. How do you, or also ideological, how do you get this, the whole perspective that Richard is laying out, and how do you combat this process that Devin is talking about, this process that keeps kind of legitimizing the debt as if it's, you know, through this this arbitrary division of people and this kind of encouragement to of violence and whatnot. I don't know if that's clear as a question, but is kind of what I'm thinking about.
I think I might have a little bit of a follow up that kind of might provide a starting point, going back to Devin's early argument. Devin, so at the beginning of your talk, getting to the so I'm trying to tie Alex's question of like strategy moving forward to the beginning of Devin's talk and the reflections on language. And I just want to double check, Devin, it's your sense that the language of debt has kind of become too broad, we use it too broadly, and it's colonized our language a little bit. Did I catch that correctly?
Absolutely, absolutely.
So I guess maybe strategically, I'd maybe challenge that and may propose flipping it on its head, because I just did a little quick etymology on the side on Google, because of course I was thinking of German Schuld, which goes back to medieval, high medieval German word for, which then goes into English as should, right? The very word that we should goes back to the German Schuld. So these are such really anthropologically given or ontologically given features of our existence. So maybe it's not so much that the use of debt language has gotten too broad, but maybe the challenge for us is to find a new word to kind of identify what exactly it is about this usurious capitalism that we're trying to fight. So maybe it's time for a neologism as opposed to trying to disentangle words like debt or Schuld.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an interesting point. I think the case can be made that way. I mean, I think what I want to do is at least provide some conceptual clarity rather than I'm under no illusions that I'm going to clear the terrain and get people to stop speaking of debt when they really mean, loyalty or obligation. But I at least want to provide some conceptual clarity so that we know that what we're speaking about when we name these things. So whether or not it's a new word, I do think that, maybe where we're in agreement is that we still need conceptual clarity in terms of what it is we're naming with those words, right? So whether we want to say it's debt and say debt marks this kind of problematic relationship, whether it's a usury, whether it's something else. Yeah, I mean, I'm sympathetic to that, but I think we need better language and conceptual language, because the same, in the same sentence, one can be invoking the need to cancel certain debts while we honor other kinds of debts, and that just gets confusing. But maybe somebody could push back and say that kind of ambiguity is actually what we need, and we need to sort of retake and queer the language of debt by sort of reappropriating it. So that could be another argument as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's what someone like Fred Moten argues at some point, that like, and actually, Devin, I felt like in one of your pieces, your concept of debt negation, like gets close to this too. Like, what if we all embrace our insolvency collectively? Like, what if we double down on our bad debt, right? If we all, I know it sounds like a joke, but it's really not. Like, what, and it really relates to what Richard's saying about debt as power, right? What if our power becomes our sort of collective inability to pay our debt at any point? Like, if you like we're giggling about that because you don't realize how serious that is. Like, I mean, I know it sounds funny, but isn't this what you do every time you go out for a beer with a really close friend, instead of using that money responsibly to pay a little bit more back on your student loans? In that moment, you're saying that human sociality is more important than anything else, even if it kills you in the eyes of the creditor. You're actually embracing your recalcitrance, your shame, your indigence, and you're making a kind of transcendental out of it. You're saying, yeah, this is what it is to be human. This is. I mean, it's not a joke. I mean, this is, and someone like, like Fred Moten is talking about this in relationship to Black studies and the Black experience, where, I mean, let's be real frank about this. Like, the people who have ended up most often in debtors' prisons, you know, and who to this day are shouldered with the most unpayable household debts are not just Black people, but Black women in particular, who are managing very different kinds of households, from you know, what gets recognized as a family, right? You know, and they're doubling down on debt so that their kids can, you know, survive. Like, so this is real. Like, this isn't like some jokey like neologism, you know. And so I just wanted to like make sure we're hearing that, you know, because I think you're bringing forward something important, Alex. Like, I think we do need to think of different language, but on the other hand, we like Devin's saying, I think we have to think about like, you know, the historic weight and the contemporary weight, right, of those concepts of being, because what is, like, to be Black in this culture is to be guilty by default, is to be among the shamed, among the, you know. So like, what are we, you know, and this, Devin, I wanted you to say more too about the link between or the strategy of lending in order to grab labor, which was like the main reason that it was done in the ancient world. Because I think, and this relates to Allison's work, I think this is part of what you're seeing now, is that this direct investment in human beings, not even human capital, but this direct investment in human beings through, would be that because it's in the interest of, you know, big data and the tech companies and surveillance capitalism, and to have to have the systems built to monitor people and so on, right? It's like a new form of it's not even in putting people into debt in order to have labor. It's just putting people into debt in order to have people, in order to have people to count. You know, so it's like this new iteration of that somehow, I think. Anyway, I wondered if you had any comments about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a huge factor, and it does relate to the you know, we see this in the ancient world in terms of entrapping labor, but it's obviously, as you know, it's still with us. And when we think about it in terms of these founding moments, like the founding of the Bank of England, which, you know, as you've noted, is partly to fund and deal with war and coloniality. But it's tied to conquest. It's tied to the expropriation of labor, and specifically dealing with the Black community. The questions of reparations as well comes up as a major debt that needs to be considered. And that's one of the things that I wanted to mention, is that we need to also develop language or criteria to be able to speak about debts that still need to be honored, right? Particularly the debt to the Black community. So. You know, in arguing for a certain kind of, you know, whether it's debt cancellation, debt negation, there are certain debts that I would not want to see shrugged off, right? So what does it mean, and how can we make what are the criteria and language we need to make a coherent case in the public sphere that we should forgive student loan debt, but we shouldn't forgive the debt owed to the Black community, right? And I think that's really important. And so, you know, to develop the language, the terms, and the criteria to assess those kinds of obligations is huge.
Jim, thanks, Devin. Jim, you wanted to get in?
Yeah, I think what you were just saying, Devin, was getting to what I wanted to ask you about. And my question is really whether your concern for a more precise understanding of the language of debt is implicitly an objection to the moralization of debt, particularly phrases like having debts of gratitude. I mean, I think you just gave a very nuanced sense of what you mean, but I'm wondering if, to some degree, we do have to recover the language of debt as a language of ethics.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, I mean, I'm so struck, Richard, by the tyranny of the rate of return. That was a cardinal point, but of course that speaks to an ethical perversion. That if we don't have a language of debt that's able to entertain complex ethical judgments, then we're going to miss a lot of corruption under the banner of something that's masquerading as economic neutrality.
Yeah, that's a huge and important point. So one of the great sort of violent mystifications of economic theory is the construal of a variety of spheres of economics as so-called neutral spheres. Money described as a neutral means of exchange, which is nonsense. And then the notion that debt is somehow a neutral instrument. So I do want to be clear when I say this, that I'm not trying to extract debt from a moral sphere, but to be clear about the kinds of moral obligations we're naming when we speak about debt versus other kinds of moral obligations. That's a great point. Absolutely. Yeah. So, I mean, debt itself marks it. Debt instruments are setting terms for how to behave in a relationship. How much more moral can you get, right? I mean, this is the kind of, again, the absurd mystification of economic, a certain kind of economic science, at least, that wants to say that this is somehow neutral when this is about setting the terms for how you treat somebody. Like it's as moral as you can get, right? So I think there's something profoundly moral about debt. And at the same time, that there are other kinds of moral bonds and ways that we have stipulated that we interact with people, gifts, whatever it might be, right? That mark other kinds of obligations. So that's the point that I want to make. But thank you for that, because that's important. I don't want to give the impression that I'm arguing for debt as an amoral or non-moral sphere.
Thank you, Devin. That's great.
Yeah, it's a particular kind of morality that is governed through a particular understanding of time and of quantification and a lot of other things that we're not looking at directly. Other questions, comments from anyone?
Yes. In bringing up reparations, for my one sociology class, we needed to read 3 articles, an argument against reparations generally, and then 2 arguments in regard to the Black community's argument for reparations for the Black community, and an argument against the type of reparations we're used to talking about in regards to indigenous populations in the United States. The argument was, we don't want money. We want a connection to our land, our sacred land, that we basically devise and conceptualize as our mother returned. And at the very least, a connection to the promises made by the US government and the United States people to the indigenous people. At the very least, maintaining the obligations taken up in the first place, not even just because you can't put your mother in a return of obligation. Just going back to your idea of how we consider debt, Devin. So, and not really a question there, but more a recognition of all of these concepts are very important in moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point. Basically naming that debt doesn't always need to be monetized in terms of monetary categories, but there are other forms of compensation that communities have evolved. But that also, I mean, that the case in terms of indigenous populations does speak to questions of politics and political sovereignty, and in what ways that sovereignty can be granted back, or some form of territorial independence, which names other kinds of exchanges that also need to be considered here, and then they can't be reduced to simply economic in the narrow sense. So that's a great point, Jimmy.
I'm wondering if Natalia wants to speak from what she just posted on the chat.
Well, yeah, I'm just trying to still think through the notion of the dead strike, because as appealing as it is, it still feels like impossible and just like hard to even imagine as a like concrete reality. So I was interested in what Richard said, that we should be kind of looking at the labor strike as a model. And I'm just thinking of like, well, what do labor strikes try to achieve? And they try to negotiate for more power and determining their contract. So if we kind of reconceive of ourselves as like the debtor class rather than like the labor class, is that what we should be trying to get at? Is like, we said the interest rate or something, or like, what are even the things to be asking for? Like, I just feel like I'm so, like dead on class conscious, that I would love to think about, steps towards becoming more conscious. And of course, this conversation is all about it.
Richard, did you want to speak to that?
I think that the idea of the debt strike, by the way, is not to dismantle capitalism. To be honest, and it's not something we can talk about. I've gotten very uncomfortable talking about capitalism. I think a lot of the evils, so-called evils we associate with capitalism are really the evils of finance. And again, one of the things that's happened over the past, well, certainly 30, 40 years, is the incredible financialization of the economy. But the idea of the debt strike is simply to create a balance of power. Right now, and I think you get that idea with the amount of investment capital, the degree in which the nation state is invested in maintaining the right of return, et cetera, you get an idea of the enormous power disconnect here. There's no check. There's no longer a check on the power of investment capital. And I think the only thing that can possibly counter that and create greater equality and a room for negotiation is in fact debt, because the economy now is built on debt. And in the same way as the industrial economy is built on labor, our economy is literally built on debt. You don't need to buy anything anymore, technically. All you've got to do is pay your debts, and that keeps the economy going. We've gone from a consumption economy to a debtor economy. And if in fact you can at least create the illusion even of debtors having a degree of power to force creditors to negotiate the terms of the arrangement, the debt strike is the only way. I think it would be interesting to, as another topic, is what kind of relationship would exist if in fact debtors had the kind of power that labor did in the 1940s and 50s.
Yeah, go ahead, Devin. I want to add something to that, but go ahead, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to respond to, because I think Natalia's way of framing it was super, super helpful and super, super clarifying. In Marxist circles and discussions of labor, there are disagreements, and I think this is part of what you're alluding to, of whether unions are a good thing or not. Right? I mean, Lenin famously was critical of unions because he says this ultimately sustains capitalism, because it's kind of a back and forth between labor and capital that enables it to be sustained. But at the same time, this is agitating for very real issues, right? So I think there's an interesting parallel that you're naming there, to the degree that we have to weigh out these issues of unions and striking for a sense of actual breakthroughs, practical provisional breakthroughs in the now to enable people to go on living, versus the ultimate horizon of some sort of total transformation, right? So like hardcore folks will say that we shouldn't have unions or striking, we should let capitalism implode on itself, we should let the contradictions run their course, right? Which, yeah, sounds great, except for everyone who's freaking starving for a wage and needs their union to help negotiate, right? So I think there's a similar parallel that we can think about when we're trying to tease out this issue with debt strikes. Either people want to go kind of radical and somehow jam the gears of the system so that it collapses, and we hopefully have something better that emerges from the ashes, which is is perhaps utopian, or we try to negotiate along the lines of a strike and look for provisional victories in the interim to make life more livable now. Maybe that sustains the system and makes capitalism last 100 years longer than it should, but it at least allows people to freaking put food on their table, right? So yeah, I mean, that's a great question, Atan. I think it's a real debate to have within, for us and for these kinds of circles is, do you push for that radical horizon where you hope that everything breaks down, or do you look for these micro interventions now to enable those who are struggling with indebtedness to survive?
Richard, did you want to say something else?
I just wanted, Devin's bringing up the point is, what's the alternative? And I think it's a great point. Now, Graeber, for example, and the whole Maussian tradition, argues that we can have an economy built on reciprocity. And you very well may be able to do that. We certainly can do that in small groups. The question, though, is whether you can have a complex economy built on that. I don't know the answer to it. Because to some extent, implicit in my statement is that there's nothing wrong with people buying and selling stuff to and for each other. Essentially, a market economy is what we're talking about. Now, market economies, of course, go back 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 years. I don't see anything necessarily wrong with a market economy. What you have now, though, is not really a market economy. It's totally something different. But the other issue that Natalia and Devin are raising, okay, what's the alternative? And I don't know what it is. I mean, when I talk about this stuff with my students, I'll actually take them to visit a religious commune that, in fact, one of Devin's predecessors at Dartmouth knew as well, a group called the 12 Tribes. Again, a communal type society that basically lives by a reciprocity. And they can do it. As Devin said, it's also utopian. And again, there's that long tradition of utopianism. But that's an alternative. Is it viable? In small groups, yes. In a large, complex society, maybe not.
Yeah, I want to use this actually as a way of getting Allison back in here, because I think she has some interesting things to say about this, and I'll set her up by saying, I think that the two issues that come up at this point are trust and the issue of accountability or transparency. And David Fleming, the late David Fleming, in his work Surviving the Future, which was kind of an imagination of what a sort of a set of smaller scale societies would look like that were less interconnected than they are now, by less transportation, less communication, internet, what that future might look like. And one of the points he makes, Fleming does in that book, is that we're going to have to give up on the idea that transparency or even accountability is really the same thing as trust, and that we might need to embrace a notion of trust that involves more sort of opacity between groups and less. I'm thinking of the Edouard Glissant's conception of opacity here in Poetics of Relation, where there's this idea that we don't really want or need full transparency or accountability between each other. We don't even have that with ourselves, and it's a real illusion, and maybe one of the main illusions driving the contemporary economy and kind of the mania for global integration is this idea that you can have or even should have full accountability and full transparency. That those seem like words that everybody just has good associations with. But I think Allison's work really shows that we should be suspicious of this. I mean, Foucault already showed this too in a lot of ways. But what if the problem is not that we need a different way of being accountable and transparent to one another other than through global finance, but that the obsession with or the kind of morality we have around what it would mean to always be completely transparent or accountable is actually the problem. And I think this relates to some of Devin's more historical research too. You invoke the idea of religious community, Richard, which is built on a lot of commonality and a lot of a certain kind of transparency around shared values. And we all know how cults can end up, and how dangerous communities can be that where there's too much presumption about shared value and too much transparency. So I mean, I don't know what the answer is for the future is either, but I've been thinking a lot about this, and I think that sort of standing down from our need to know everything about what everyone else is doing and why they're doing it, what their motivations are at all times, is actually part of what's needed. So do you want to say something about this, Allison? Because I know you're looking at this kind of mania for transparency and accountability and how it's being monetized.
Well, I think in terms of just looking at language, the term trust essentially at this point is being advanced as cover for blockchain. And that's being used to monitor and sort of police all sort of transactions from, media, content. Everything is going to go on this, not that it is trust, but it's becoming swapped out for trust. I don't know, I'm still processing a lot of this. It's strange because the research I've done, it just keeps getting wider, and pandemic has sort of widened it to the point that I'm interfacing online with a lot of people that I never would have crossed paths with. And it's interesting to me to try to navigate who can engage with the content like I'm surfacing and who shuts down. And some of the people I thought that would be interested in engaging with it aren't. And then people who are very unusual and often seem to have an undercurrent of spirituality across the spectrum, from like evangelical Christians to shamans to energy healers, like people I'd never, as someone who's not part of organized religion, like interface with, they seem to get it or be interested enough to engage around it. And so I do feel like there's something of the spiritual, like intangible, relational, human to nature. I threw, and I know I've dumped a lot of stuff in the chat, but there's a really pivotal video from IXO Foundation. It's only about 2.5 minutes. It's very short, but essentially it talks about quantifying the world, like quantifying the entire world, including people, for this stakeholder capitalism and how it will be done. And it has overlays of trees and numbers, and it's distilling all of that into what ostensibly they would like us to believe is a transparent transactional relationship, but is not that. And I think the future has to go beyond it. I don't know exactly how we get there. I'm not saying any of it's easy, and I thought we had more time. Like, I did not anticipate pandemic would be this pivot point. I think this idea that we have windows for micro actions is shrinking. Like, I thought we had 5 years or so. Like, I'm feeling like it's maybe 6 months. And I do feel like, what is the point of fight back? And it's such a big educational process. But if we allow ourselves to be hooked into digital identity systems, and this is happening globally, this is not just a US issue, we will be commodities. We will become data commodities. I mean, and maybe if you're rich enough, you can find a way to somewhat extract yourself or like build walls or limit yourself, but between geofencing and privatized public benefits, our data will be our way to live. And I don't know how we back that out unless we take down all the 5G, all the cells. Like, I don't know. So to me, that's my hill at the moment to stand on, is like, and I don't want to sound like, it doesn't have to be a chip. They don't actually have to put a chip in you. They just need your thumbprint or your retinal scan and link it to the database. And then going forward, it's just different. Like in this idea of debt and tracking and your worth and your value, because it is financial, but it's more than that. It's like seeing how social mores and rules get set. Like, it's been fascinating. And I'm not a psychologist, but like,
yeah,
the last 3 weeks, I don't know. It's just been really interesting to think how things that shouldn't be digitized become digitized and become automated. So anyway, I'll pause.
No, but this is a really incredible way in which some of Devon's research is relevant here on, early Christian conceptions of salvation or inclusion in the Christian community were framed as being sort of stamped with the image of Christ, as if you were being coined or minted, as if your very selfhood or your body was being impressed in the way that a coin is and validated. And I'm really fascinated by this for a lot of different reasons, but it's almost as if the human body or the human person, right? Graeber writes about this a lot too, like really is the thing that is both counted and countable, and that there's something about the money form that simply like reveals that or elaborates on that, but that it's almost as if some form of like what Foucault would call biopower is already there with something like the way that Christians thought of themselves as being included in the divine economy by allowing themselves to be sort of surveilled by the pastorate and radically known to one another as believers, radically available to one another from their hearts, radically transparent, basically. Devon, do you want to say more about? You can speak better about this than I can. It's your research.
No, that's great. Yeah, I mean, there's a long and perhaps troubling trajectory of the integration of certain kinds of technologies, and we can include money as a kind of technology for sure in that, and surveillance. But I mean, it goes back to things like census taking, which is a kind of biopolitical cataloging that even is in the ancient world, to money as a way to, in some way, track the kinds of transactions happening within a community. Money is one attempt for a sovereign organizing center to at least track and tabulate exchanges, even if they're perhaps somewhat anonymous. But as Joshua mentions, this does become a powerful metaphor for being minted in the image of Christ. Christ can be construed as a kind of coin sent from the Father, the sort of chief coin, the governing coin that sets the economy of salvation right. And that all hearts and souls are open before God and seen by God, which then becomes, a powerful metaphor in the Middle Ages. And then we can go to Bentham and the Panopticon and then Foucault, as Joshua mentioned. So there's this long trajectory. I have a friend working on current language that you can find of pastors using the language of drones to talk about the eye of God. And they're using it in as if it's lovely, like the same way that drones can see all, God can see into your soul. Like it's just this really profound, disturbing resonance that's still being used today of kind of surveillance. So it's work to support the state and sovereignty, I guess. Yeah, I mean, it raises the question of whether there are counter ways that it can be countered to that. I still remain somewhat, I guess, pessimistic about those possibilities, but maybe they're there. I did want to bring in prosperity, because Carlos had brought that up, about prosperity theology as sort of another manifestation, or this linkage between notions of wealth and divine favor, right? But we can see this from at many different points in the church, that different notions of your economic standing reflect somehow your status before God. So prosperity teaching, although it does seem like a very modern phenomenon, is drawing on very long-standing kinds of ideas within Christian thought about one's moral status or spiritual status somehow then being reflected in their economic situation. And of course, we can look at Max Weber's Protestants as well, and the Reformation as another instance of this. So there are different moments of this kind of connection there.
Thanks, Devin. Other questions, comments on this theme?
Yeah,
Or something else? Jimmy. Yeah.
I want to tap into Allison's urgency over the ability to do something concrete. Before doing that, I want to bring in a couple different ideas. Immanuel Kant had, I believe it was him, brought up this idea that anyone could be made into a Christian if you just get them to kneel down and move their lips to a prayer. You could make...
That's Pascal, Jimmy. Yeah.
Oh, Pascal.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
My apologies on that. And it really comes into these ideas of rituals that Devin's been explicitly discussing, and I wanted to bring in Cleo's work, Cleo Kern's work, a little bit, that she really discusses a lot of our current rituals coming from a lot of Christian thought in a lot of different directions. And that some of the solutions lay in rituals that currently exist. I just wanted to bring that in and recognize Devin explicitly bringing that to the fore and talk about how we can move concretely into the future. I have Glenn's tract on For Education, the college classroom as a concrete utopia. And it's crystallized in the beginning. A big motif in his tract is this quote from Henry, I'm going to butcher the last name, Lefebvre, in The Production of Space. Change life, change society. These precepts mean nothing without the production of an appropriate space. New social relationships call for a new space, and vice versa. Spaces creating relationships, and relationships creating the spaces. So I would say Insight Seminars and online seminars is birthed from an idea similar to this. And with us in this space now, I don't know who to really pivot to on this, but turning this conversation into concrete action on the debt strike, maybe Adam Coate would be able to hit heavy on this, being an organizer himself.
Thank you, Jimmy. Other folks out there, excuse me if I'm not seeing you. Yeah, well, somebody have a comment or question? Let me see. Actually, Jimmy, you were making me want to go back actually to Natalia's question a few minutes ago. In terms of, you know, the organizing side of this, I think one of the things we have to remember about the labor movement as well, in terms of its possible parallel to this, is that the formation of labor unions themselves was actually a kind of cooling off of a much hotter movement, which was the workers movement, which was basically a communist insurgency that was then co-opted and brought into dialogue or relationship with capital. And there's you know, there's a way that, you know, someone asked about this. Oh, I think it was Allison. Like, you know, we could very well succeed in a debt strike and succeed in having certain demands met, but the concession might be on our part, we have to agree to allow our bodies to become, you know, human capital commodities or something. We could enter into some further state of subordination and domination, right? That's always the risks that we run. But I think that part of what is important, and I think you're speaking to it, Jimmy, is, I know this is something that Natalia is interested in, and I know Glenn is too, like, how do we prefigure the kind of world that we want to live in the very act of disrupting the one that we're already part of, right? And I agree with you that spaces like this are important in the sense that no one's really being paid for this. We're doing this, we're all doing this excessively. And this is in a way, this is an example of doubling down on our debts. I mean, nobody's getting a line in their CV for this. It's not going on anyone's resume. For those of us who've been willing to have the recording out there, it will probably, you know, it could make us targets for right-wing trolls or whatever. I don't know. This is like, what we're doing right now is doubling down on our indebtedness. So this is a kind of, but what's my point? Well, sure, there's lots of ways of doing this. That people are already doing, in terms of living into the strange kind of power of embracing, you know, our indebtedness or our poverty, really, to use Laura Earl's terms. But just wanted to resonate with what you're bringing forward, Jimmy. Other questions, comments? Devin, I wanted to make sure, was there anything that you had prepared to say that you wanted to bring out further?
I mean, the only other thing was just going to talk about why debt cancellation is problematic. I mean, I think you already kind of alluded to that, so I don't know if I need to.
Please do that. Yeah, I think that's really important to reiterate. Yeah.
I mean, just if folks are wondering where this comes from in terms of some of at least my suspicions or concerns about the language of Jubilee or debt cancellation. So just to note again, I mean, I think it's important to note the trajectories of this, that one of the reasons we even talk about Jubilee today, and have this language is because it's been conveyed again through Jewish and Christian tradition, right? And so to acknowledge that trajectory and all the baggage that might bring. But debt cancellation in the ancient Near East, where this practice emerged, was a practice of sovereignty. It was a practice of the emperor declaring this. It even became ritualized, where when a new emperor came to the throne, part of their rites of institution was to declare Jubilee, and was to sort of crack the tablets symbolically as a way to sort of symbolically show the resetting of the economy, things starting afresh, clearing of the tablets, beginning again under this authority. And so it was a way to declare supremacy. It's a way to declare sovereignty even over all economic relationships. And so it's sort of underlines the links here that we've been talking about, that debt relationships and even the sort of regulation of them, even the cancellation of them, is linked to state power in some ways. And so to what extent, if we invoke the language of debt cancellation, and this also gets to Natalia's important point, To what extent, if we invoke the language of debt cancellation, are we then relying upon a sovereign, a state, an authority figure to sort of make that debt cancellation valid and valuable? And to what extent does that then give more power to those kinds of hierarchies and authorities? And is that a trade-off that one is willing to make for the sort of provisional relief of a certain level of indebtedness, which then we then are then trading to give more power to the authorities? And I wanted to know just another connection to the military, because this has been coming up as well in terms of the military, but we see this in the ancient world as well. But one of the reasons for debt cancellation, or one of the reasons to limit indebtedness, was because the sovereign was concerned that they wouldn't be able to conscript people for the military if they were in debt slavery to their neighbor or to a creditor. So being in debt slavery eliminated you from the taxable population, and we're no longer a free subject to basically draft for the army. This is still with us today. I was just doing some research on payday lending practices, and there are a lot of specific laws in various states that prohibit or limit payday lending to service personnel in the military, to those who are in service in different ways, because of the ways it's going to impede their military service to the state. So that kind of concern is still there, with this desire to maintain a military industrial complex, and indebtedness, too much indebtedness, as gumming up the system there. So it's interesting that the sovereign also appears to have a stake involved in debt cancellation or limiting debt. And so raising again questions about what it means to then argue for jubilee or debt cancellation. Is debt negation or debt strike something different that can help limit that sort of sovereign oversight?
Hey, Devin, Carlos has been wondering about the relationship that something like liberation theology might have to some of these questions. Would you mind speaking to that a little bit?
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of interesting contributions that liberation theology has made. I mean, one of the main ones has been to sort of try to reorient the conversations in theology toward consideration of the marginalized. The so-called preferential option for the poor is kind of a language that liberation theology has helped disseminate, this idea that according to certain interpretations of Christian tradition, that God sides with the poor and the oppressed, right? So this can be a very powerful ideological tool then, if one wants to use that to marshal for radical types of movements that need some kind of symbolic overhang, some sort of symbolic canopy. If people need a transcendental or transcendent motivation, then this might work for some folk. Obviously, again, it's limited perhaps to those who feel the kind of force of something like that. The claims of a God figure or a sacred scripture in that way. So, I think liberation theology has definitely helped within certain progressive religious circles to at least give people language to be able to still link up with their kinds of spiritual traditions, but a more progressive or leftist vision, and reclaim that from more conservative language of people obeying their masters and people obeying the state in the name of God, those kinds of things. So it's helped, I think, invigorate a certain radical or at least left-leaning progressive religious imagination. But again, I think it's whether it would be useful for a broad-based movement is hard to say. Although again, one can make the argument that churches are really central in this kinds of grassroots organizing, and that one needs to engage with folks who are religious and who are believers. And so this could be one source of that language.
Thanks, Devin. Yeah. Other questions, comments from anybody?
One comment. I mean, Devin brings up an interesting point about what you in fact create. David Graeber, for example, would not support a debt strike. And his rationale is that, again, in a debt strike, you're in effect appealing to the nation state to somehow take action in terms of rules, regulations, etc. And by doing so, you're legitimizing the state. The other point I just wanted to make, and it goes, I throw this back to Devin, is right now you have globally a move to very authoritarian governments, and obviously in various forms, possibly as a consequence of the 2007-2008 recession. And the question becomes, what happens now with the COVID pandemic? I mean, I've always maintained that if you ever had a collapse of the government in the United States, the group that by far is most prepared to take over is the religious right. Even the Christian Reconstructionists that would, in a sense, impose a theological, government. And it strikes me is that's a possibility down the line, given what's happening now. And I wanted to get Devin's sense of how he thinks about that.
I mean, one sort of neat reflex response is interesting that not only has Margaret Atwood written about that very sort of thing with the handmaid's tale, but she's also written about debt. She has a book about debt as well,
Yep. Uh-huh.
Which is fascinating. So there's connections there. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, in terms of that kind of projection, in terms of what groups are ready to mobilize, I mean, I think that's a very real possibility and a troubling one. But I mean, it has been. Yeah, I mean, it has been observed that it seems like there's, in terms of a kind of ideological unification, the right definitely has a leg up over the left in terms of a sense of ideological unification. So they do have an advantage in terms of claiming a power vacuum, and the sort of the adage that the left keeps devouring itself with all of its internal critiques. Yeah, I mean, it's a very real concern, at least to think about. But this goes back to, again, kind of the whether those on the right and the religious right in particular have a certain love of sovereignty, have a love for a certain kind of hierarchical top-down command and control structure that also enables them to respond perhaps more quickly and decisively. And we see this as well now happening with the pandemic, right? Which raises issues. I mean, I'm interested in terms of Allison's thoughts on this too, but why is it that these very authoritarian regimes, at least China and at least in South Korea to some extent, have been able to, at least apparently, I mean, we don't know if this is, all misinformation, but at least apparently deal with the outbreak in a way that's been very efficient and effective, right? Which is the so-called, the good side of a benevolent dictatorship, or at least some sort of centralized control. When it works, it appears to handle these kinds of things well. But then is the trade-off worth it in terms of the limitations on freedoms and human rights and surveillance? Which is another very real, I think, concern that this crisis raises.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of activism around that point, Devin, I'm reminded actually of Electra Simile's sort of question to you from the symposium about your book, when she was saying, I think she was saying effectively, like, well, if in the West in some way governmentality and sovereignty have bifurcated somehow, if there's some separation between them such that some of how power and authority is working is because we're just doing it through everyday practices and through the kinds of self-surveillance and modes of self-fashioning and self-governance that we have been inculcated in us over 3 centuries now, at least. I mean, much longer for sure. But then in that case, there is like, and I kind of hear her coming from like an Italian kind of autonomous perspective on this. Like there's a lot of room for practical experimentation and resistance. I mean, I share your skepticism and sober and somber kind of view of how effective any of these things may be, but at least in principle, the idea is that, okay, sure, certain like right-wing groups or theopolitically organized groups or neo-fascist fantasizing people can be excited about sovereignty all they want to be, but we're in this era where there's this weirdly autonomous power of governmentality, largely mediated through the anonymity of money and through the kind of like the kind of open-endedness of practice, so that there is actually maybe more room than we think. I'm just kind of I'm not super convinced by that, but it was just, I mean, it might be something folks want to hear about. But
yeah, I'd be interested to talk about that too. I mean, there's room for experimentation, but I guess the fear is, and this is some of that Allison has raised, the co-optation of that, right? Like there could be cool technology being pioneered that might have liberatory directions, but it's so quickly co-opted. And this is, links back with the thought
This is my own. I've always been very skeptical of like alternative currency movements and like gift economies, revergence of bars. Like I have friends who study solidarity economies like Craig Baroniak that I'm really interested in, but that solidarity is very rarely mediated by these kind of like techno utopian fantasies. So anyway, that's just me.
Yeah. One of the thoughts that I had when I was listening to Richard cite these just amazing figures in terms of how much capital is being held by, you know, hedge funds and global firms versus how much capital is there in national budgets from taxes and GDP, and how it's just like it's dizzying in terms of how it's dwarfed. But, you know, and that if these hedge fund people wanted to get together, they could outnumber the budgets of nations whenever they wanted to. But why hasn't this led to the sort of, you know, Hart and Negri's like, oh, destabilization of the nation state, and now all capital is fluid and the nation is being undermined? And part of it's because, you know, and that why haven't these hedge fund folks gotten together and undermined the nation? It's because they still need it, right? They still need it. They require the rule of law to enforce the contracts. They require all the infrastructure that mediates the financial works, everything, layers of materiality that are still undergirded by something called territorial sovereignty, rule of law, nation, etc. So they're still ingrained. But then my concern, going back to your question or your what you were wondering too, is that whatever sorts of experimentations that can be devised to try to circumvent national power could then be co-opted by those very same players who have all this power and who also want to find ways around it. I mean, this is part of what the Panama Papers was getting at with the kind of offshore tax shelters as well, trying to find ways around the nation state. So there are lots of interests there that are opposed, but that want the same thing, but can use it for very different ends.
I mean, this, for me, I want to see what folks think about this. I mean, this brings up something very fundamental for me, which is, you know, the idea that to have an economy, an oikonomia, an oikos, right, is to be able to boundary a household, right? And how this, in a way, can't be moved, even you know, and maybe this is what the nation, this is where coming back around is that why the nation state is so intractable, or something like sovereign states, because there's something about economy itself, which is about determining who is within and who's outside of a certain membrane, or a certain kind of, whether it's a family or a tribe or a nation or whatever. And it's about like a certain kind of boundary work. I'm thinking about like Paulina's work on boundaries and borders that I know you know about, Devin, but like, it's also, I really think that this is the point at which like a lot of the work that's been done for a long time in feminist theory, feminist Marxism, about householding and deep critiques of the productive economy, but also like Federici's work, you know, on the body as sort of the principal kind of site at which this whole question about what is and isn't included or counted in an economy or as part of it, there's a whole inclusion and exclusion problem, which we normally think of as being something like a political theological problem and that pertains to, you know, the political and not the economic. But maybe that it really is the key economic question in some ways, like who's included in our household, or who is included in provisioning and care and who isn't. Because generally, you know, the reason why churches and religious communities don't lend to one another at all, or if they do, they don't do it at interest, right, is because they identify with one another, right? It's sort of like how do you have an economy without having people that you don't identify with, basically without having enemies. Like, I wonder if like the whole concept, I mean, this is sort of my own speculative thinking here right now, but like, I really wonder if we have to dispense with economy altogether as a way of thinking about society, because it might be predicated on a certain kind of violence or enmity or refusal to have more porous, you know, boundaries. Even, I mean, thinking about Philip here, like even the boundaries between the human and the non-human, or human and other sentient beings. So there's just, I really think, I'm just opening this up because I actually think that these kinds of questions that we're coming to, and these are really this general. Like I'm not sure that we can solve a lot of the problems that are posed here without starting to talk about, you know, deep ecology, and starting to listen to, you know, what, you know, the feminist traditions and you know, and the deep critiques of the way that these things are always racialized, you know, have to say to us, because it is about determining who's with us and who isn't, you know, who's included, who's excluded, and religious communities are all about that. So anyway, I'm spitballing, but I wanted to sort of point arrows for folks in just how broad these problems are.
Well, one thing that's been
Adam.
Oh, sorry.
Glenn, did you want to make a?
No, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, where are you?
Oh,
Adam, go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I just wanted to say, I mean, one of the most fascinating boundaries that have been drawn in the COVID pandemic, at least in the United States, is the concept of an essential worker. Yeah. And the fact that term is, they probably should have focus grouped that word differently. Because once you're being told that you're essential, like how do you take that back? How do you, then you're not an essential worker? Like, I mean, that kind of is not what essential means. So what's fascinating to me is that how contradictory like authority is being demonstrated. And like, I'm not sure if anyone really believes the stay-at-home order makes people stay at home or doesn't, right? Like it's what's on display is these borders, or the ability for the state to be the authority is kind of crumbling. Like it needs people to go to work, but it also needs people not to go to work, to not be sick. This is what essential, this is what's not. I mean, it's all about redrawing the borders of inclusion and exclusion in the quote unquote economy. And the way they've drawn it ironically makes it seem as though the people who are responsible for maintaining the economy are not the ones who benefit from the economy. And I know that's really crass, and that's probably super obvious and banal to state, but in terms of my work trying to organize and figure out what it means to organize in this global crisis, or whatever, this event, is how much that resonates. Like that is a spectacular way to start that conversation and that thought process and that ideological shift, is with this idea of there being something, what is essential to the economy, it turns out to be the people we treat the most shitty.
Yeah. It's going to be interesting after this, whether Republicans keep talking about givers and takers. When you got, store clerks and healthcare workers keeping us going.
They just didn't choose the right word. They didn't think about it.
Oh, it wasn't. It was a great word.
Yeah, I mean, and it's interesting that to connect this to care, to the need for care work. I mean, we're in this moment that's making it obvious, right? That the vast majority of what needs to be done is not factory production or productive consumption or like any of the great categories of classical political economy or even Marxism. What has to happen is care work, reproductive work, reparative work, restorative work, and that's that should be the center. That should be the center, and that's precisely what we deliberately fail to count. That's what isn't counted, or maybe even can't be counted, or the hours we spend with our children, or taking care of our homes, things like that. Other people want to get?
I just want to say just one quick thing regarding something that Devin said, and it's come up with the debt. Getting back to the debt strike a lot, and I think he pointed out the danger in the sense that if you weaponize the debt, then anybody can use it. And in fact, probably one of the most notable uses of it was by the Tea Party in the American Congress, when they threatened not to repay U.S. debts unless they did certain things, one of which was defund Planned Parenthood. So one of the examples you actually have of a debt strike, in fact, it came from sources that I'm sure most of us, would not particularly approve of.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really important point. And for me, it brings up the idea that a movement like a debt strike would have to be nested within something broader and more encompassing. It's not a standalone hack, for sure. I'm just conscious of the time, 1:56, and folks that have, only, committed 4 hours is a massive commitment already. So I don't want to stretch anyone or tax anyone further, but does anybody have anything else they really want to say or bring forward before we close up?
I had one kind of thought or question. I posted a little bit about it in the chat, which is just this idea that we're talking about debt strikes and we're talking about all of these sort of like solidifications of power throughout society, through technology and through debt, of course, and like these sort of like, overarching gods of power over society that seems to be on the rise. And I guess I have this feeling that like that sort of creates this sort of like prison state, essentially. This thing that we have as citizens have very little control over. And I wonder if we might think of, instead of debt strike, of it, instead of comparing just to a labor strike, thinking of it as a prison strike and what the implication of that would be in terms of like how power can be leveraged in those cases.
I find this idea really, really powerful. I mean, partly from speaking from a abolitionist decarceration kind of perspective, and I think it, people in prison are in some ways they seem to be an extension of the history of enslaved labor. In pretty direct ways that people have written about. So there's, and if someone like Achille Mbembe, argues that the protocols of anti-blackness that have given us the carceral state in America, among other things, are the same ones that Allison's looking at that are first rolled out against Black communities, against non-white communities, but then become the protocols that of surveillance and control and capture for the community generally, so that it might be better actually to think of ourselves as being pulled in, all of us as being pulled into a kind of carcerality in a very general way, so that I know at least for me personally, I take almost all of my inspiration politically, and I take all of my marching orders intellectually from the Afro-Caribbean and Black liberationist writers, maybe because of this, that instinctually I think that we really are living under. I mean, I basically take the line that modernity is sort of inherently colonizing and carceral, and that it was never really about industry or efficiency or technology or productivity. That was just a kind of excuse to incarcerate the planet on some level. So I'm on board with that. I mean, that makes sense to me, but I want to hear what other people think about it too.
Well, I will just say that I think that your inspiration coming from the Caribbean is inspiring and generates some hope. I think the idea, that these power structures have been overcome in the past and could be overcome again in the future.
Yeah, Haiti. I mean, exactly. Anyone else? I wish that we all had unlimited time and energy, because it feels like we could all talk about this for a lot longer, but maybe we'll do. Go ahead, Glenn. Yeah.
The third session, Joshua.
Yeah, I mean, I just maybe on that note, two things. That I am ramping up to teach a 6-week seminar on the beginning of my new book project, For the Remains. It will center around a lot of these questions of debt in relation to sovereignty and the state. But the larger project of the book is pushing toward what I was hinting at, this idea of like, what if we need to abolish the very notion of economy as such to get to where we really want to be. And it hooks in ultimately with some of the things that have been going on in the chat, like thinking about our primary activity as human beings is being a sort of dealing with an ancestral inheritance through grief and through practices of inheriting but also contesting the remains of the past. That's sort of how I'm trying to think about what the center of anything like an economy, or what used to be called an economy, should be. That's where I'm going intellectually. If you want to take that ride with me, it's going to start in early May. And the other thing is, I mentioned, Natalia and I are going to organize a kind of post-capitalist reading group. We're thinking about calling it compost capitalism, which is like with an exclamation point after it, like let's compost it, which also resonates with my obsession with soil creation and kind of ancestral work. So maybe folks can join us for that later in the summer when it gets rolling. But yeah, if there's some way to, and last but not least, I think actually, Glenn, what the third would be, I think really is going to be what Allison is going to bring forward when she has a chance to really lay out more of her research, which is so important and so incredibly integrative. I mean, I really encourage folks to show up for that whenever we can get on the books in a few weeks. Because really the way that these systems of big data, surveillance, blockchain identity, the police, carcerality, they really do converge and integrate. And it's really not a conspiracy, folks. It's just a business plan. It's just a business plan. You don't need to get all weird about this. Like they put it on their website. This is what they think is good for us. I think it's good for everyone. This is what they're offering. So, we need to take it seriously. So, show up for that if you can. I think that's all I have to say.
Devin and Richard, do you have any final comments?
No, just thank you very much.
Yeah, this has been really
putting this on and then inviting us.
I mean, it's incredible. There's still 20-some people on, and it was an incredible feast of knowledge. I'm not going to add any more to it. You know how to get to our website by now if you're here, so have a look. There are a lot of really interesting things coming up. Something on Hannah Arendt, something on Black, White, Riot, A.K. Thompson's book. Cindy Milstein's going to do something. I'm not even sure what the title is, Natalia, at this point. Do you?
Viral Grief, Rebellious Mourning is going to be kind of a virtual grief circle based on her work called Rebellious Mourning, an anthology of all of the unnecessary losses that our system has produced, sort of adapted for this moment of the pandemic and all the grief that we're kind of thrown into. It should be really cool. I think it's going to be on Tuesday, the 21st.
Beautiful. And Cleo Kearns has something in the works called Sacrifice, Debt, and Grief in Capitalist Regimes. Other stuff. We have groups. Please, keep an eye on this. Keep this going. Join us when you can. It's heartening to see everybody here, and the richness of your contributions it's incredible and inspiring and encouraging. And so thank you again, Joshua, for putting this together.
Yeah. I also wanted to say thanks, even though I don't believe in it. I contradict myself. I contain multitudes.
The language problem keeps arising, right? At some point, we're going to have to really figure that out.
Yeah, but I mean, thank you again, Richard and Devin, for your time and your energy and your research. It's just been huge for me, and I just wanted to thank everybody else for all your attention and your energy. It's great to see all of you. Yeah.
Thank you again.
Yeah. All right. See everybody soon.
Next time.
Yeah. Until next time. Yeah.
Thank you.
Until next time.
Yeah.